Mind the draft as you step into the hall and try not to let that heavy oak door slam behind you. Tonight, we're slipping into the hushed, velvet-draped world of a Victorian manor. A place where the carpets are thick enough to swallow your footsteps, and the walls are decorated with ancestors who seem to be watching your every move with profound disappointment. The air here is a heavy mix of coal soot, expensive beeswax polish, and the faint, metallic scent of rain clinging to the umbrellas in the stand. You've arrived with nothing but a single trunk and a heart full of trepidation, standing in a house where even the grandfather clock doesn't just tell the time, it judges you for being 5 minutes late. It's grand, it's imposing, and it's utterly suffocating. And let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. At least not without a stern lecture on your posture and a sudden, overwhelming urge to run away and join a circus just to see a bit of colour. So, before the head housekeeper finds us loitering in the hall, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying our little escape from the modern world. And do drop your location and local time in the comments. It's a lovely bit of company to know where you're all listening from as the house settles for the night. Now, dim those lights, perhaps click on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive just before dusk, which feels symbolic in a way that's almost too on the nose. The carriage ride has been long and slightly nauseating, and as you step down onto the gravel drive, you're already trying to remember whether you're supposed to curtsy first or speak first, or just exist silently until acknowledged. The house looms ahead, large, symmetrical, and deeply committed to making you feel small. A maid appears as if summoned by your anxiety. She doesn't smile. That's your first clue. You are not quite one of them. Inside, the hallway stretches longer than seems architecturally necessary, lined with portraits of stern ancestors who look like they disapproved of you centuries before you were born. You're shown into a sitting room where the lady of the house waits. She rises just enough to acknowledge you, which is both polite and somehow dismissive at the same time, a skill perfected in Victorian society. Being a governess in the 19th century is technically a respectable profession. That's the mainstream fact everyone likes to repeat. You're educated, you're literate, and you're employed in a role that suggests refinement. But here's the quieter truth. You are also a walking social contradiction. Not quite a servant, definitely not family, and permanently balanced in a kind of awkward human middle shelf. The lady of the house asks you a few questions. Your French, your piano, your moral character. You answer carefully, aware that each word is being weighed like delicate porcelain. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you recall that many governesses were hired based on their ability to teach accomplishments, music, drawing, languages, rather than academic rigor. So yes, your ability to stumble through a polite French conversation might matter more than, say, your understanding of mathematics. Priorities, you're dismissed with a nod and handed over to the housekeeper, who is, in many ways, the true ruler of this domain. If the lady is the face of authority, the housekeeper is its spine. She inspects you with a glance that feels like it could iron wrinkles out of time itself. Your room is shown to you next. It's small, tucked away somewhere between the family quarters and the servants' wing, which feels about right. The bed is narrow but clean, and there's a small writings desk by the window. This will become your sanctuary, your office, and occasionally your emotional support structure. You set your things down and sit for a moment, letting the silence settle. It's not a comfortable silence. It's the kind that presses gently but persistently against your ears. You're already aware that your days here will be structured, observed, and quietly judged. Historians still argue whether governesses experienced more psychological strain than other domestic roles, precisely because of this in-between status. You're educated enough to recognize your isolation, but not empowered enough to escape it easily. It's like being self-aware in a very polite cage. Dinner is your first real test. You are invited to dine with the family, but not quite as an equal. You sit slightly apart, included but not integrated, like a decorative plant that occasionally speaks French. Conversation flows around you, and you contribute when addressed, careful not to overstep or underperform. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some governesses developed elaborate strategies to avoid making eye contact during meals, as prolonged engagement could be interpreted as either boldness or awkwardness, both equally dangerous in a society obsessed with nuance. So yes, you may find yourself studying your soup with the intensity of a scholar decoding ancient texts. The children are introduced after dinner. They are clean, well-dressed, and already assessing you with the quiet calculation of small aristocrats. You are, after all, the newest addition to their daily routine. Somewhere between a teacher and a mildly entertaining experiment, you exchange polite greetings, noting their ages, their posture, their potential for chaos. You'll be responsible for their education, their manners, and occasionally their emotional development, which feels like a lot considering you've just met them and are still mentally unpacking your trunk. A brief tour of the schoolroom follows. It's functional, lined with books and a blackboard that has seen better days. This is where most of your life will unfold. Lessons, corrections, quiet sighs. You run your fingers along the desk, already imagining the rhythm of days to come. As night settles in, you return to your room. The house has grown quieter, though not entirely silent. There's always a faint hum, footsteps, distant voices, the creak of old wood adjusting to the weight of history. You sit at your desk and consider writing a letter home. Many governesses relied heavily on correspondence to maintain a sense of identity outside their roles. Letters were lifelines, carefully composed, often delayed but deeply cherished. You dip your pen in ink and begin, describing your arrival in measured terms. You don't mention the unease. Not yet. That might come later, once you've found the right words, or once the silence comes too loud to ignore. Before bed, you glance at your reflection. You look composed, which is half the battle. In Victorian society, appearance is not just about vanity. It's about signaling control, discipline, and belonging. Even if you feel like a slightly confused ghost drifting through someone else's life, you lie down, the mattress firm beneath you, and stare at the ceiling. Tomorrow will begin early. Lessons, expectations, observation. You'll learn the rhythms of the house, the preferences of the children, the subtle cues that dictate when to speak and when to remain elegantly silent. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet question lingers. How long can you maintain this balance? Sleep comes slowly, wrapped in the unfamiliar sounds of a house that is not yours, in a life that is now entirely yours to navigate. Morning arrives not with a gentle sunrise, but with a kind of quiet insistence, light creeping through thin curtains, the distant clatter of kitchen activity already underway, and that ever-present clock reminding you that time, here, is not yours to negotiate with. You're awake before you fully realize it, lying still for a moment as you remember where you are. Ah yes, the polite cage. You dress carefully, every button fastened with the awareness that presentation is half your profession. A Victorian governess is expected to look modest, neat, and entirely unremarkable, which, ironically, requires a surprising amount of effort. Too fashionable, and you risk seeming above your station. Too plain, and you appear negligent. It's a delicate balance, like trying to be invisible while also being impeccably visible. Breakfast is taken quickly, often alone or in partial company. The family may dine separately, or you might be invited in again under that same strange condition of semi-inclusion. Today you eat with the children, which means your role begins immediately. No easing into the day, just straight into gentle correction mode. Sit up straight. Use your fork properly. No, not like that, like this. You hear your own voice adopting a calm firmness that feels slightly borrowed, as though you've stepped into a role already scripted. Which, in a way, you have. Lessons begin promptly in the schoolroom. This is your domain, your stage, your daily proving ground. You arrange books, slates, and materials with practiced efficiency, even though it's only your second day. The children settle in varying degrees of compliance, one attentive, one distracted, one already testing the limits of your patience, with the subtlety of a cat nudging a glass off a table, a mainstream historical fact. Governesses were typically responsible for educating children up to a certain age, usually until boys were sent off to boarding school and girls transitioned into more socially focused instruction. So yes, you are laying the intellectual groundwork for future aristocrats. No pressure. You begin with reading, guiding them through passages with careful pronunciation and comprehension. Then writing. Penmanship is crucial. because apparently the future of society hinges on elegant loops and consistent spacing. Arithmetic follows, which is met with sighs that could rival theatrical performances. Here's where the challenge deepens. You are not just teaching subjects, you are shaping behavior. Discipline must be firm but never harsh. Authority must be established without ever appearing domineering. It's like trying to train a group of small, well-dressed squirrels using only polite suggestions. One child fidgets constantly. Another stares out the window as though longing for a life of dramatic escape. You redirect, refocus, repeat. Over and over. There's a rhythm to it, a slow, steady cadence that becomes almost hypnotic. And then there's French. You switch languages with a mental gear shift, encouraging them to speak, to listen, to mimic. Your accent is not perfect, but it's acceptable, which, in this context, is everything. The goal is not fluency so much as refinement. If they can politely greet someone in Paris without causing offense, you've done your job. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on accomplishments over rigorous academics limited the intellectual development of upper-class children, or whether it simply reflected the social priorities of the time. Either way, you're here, conjugating verbs while silently wondering if anyone actually uses this many formal phrases in real life. Mid-morning brings a short break, which is less a pause and more a shift in tone. You supervise rather than instruct, watching as the children stretch, chatter, and occasionally attempt minor rebellions like sneaking extra biscuits. You intervene gently because even snack-related anarchy must be contained. Back to lessons. Geography now. Maps are unfolded, places pointed to, facts recited. You speak of distant lands with a calm authority, even if your own travel experience is limited to that slightly bumpy carriage ride yesterday. Still, you make it vivid. Rivers, mountains, cities. Because imagination is part of the curriculum, whether officially acknowledged or not. A quirky tidbit. Some Victorian families insisted that governesses teach children using globes that were already outdated, simply because they were expensive and therefore good enough. So yes, you might be confidently describing borders that no longer exist, which is a fun little historical irony. Lunchtime arrives, and with it, a brief reprieve. The children are handed off temporarily, and you're left with a pocket of time that feels both precious and oddly uncertain. Do you rest? Do you review lessons? Do you stare into the middle distance and question your life choices? You choose a bit of all three. The afternoon resumes with music. Piano lessons, to be precise. You guide small fingers across keys, correcting posture, encouraging rhythm. The melodies are simple, repetitive, and somehow both soothing and mildly haunting. You've played these pieces so many times they've begun to echo in your dreams. Dorang follows. Sketches of flowers, landscapes, occasionally something abstract that a child insists is a horse, but looks more like an enthusiastic potato. You nod thoughtfully, offering praise and gentle guidance. Artistic interpretation is a delicate terrain. You don't want to crush creativity, but you also don't want to encourage a future career in potato horse realism. Throughout it all, you remain composed. That's the expectation. No matter how repetitive, how draining, how quietly absurd some moments may be, you maintain a steady presence. You are the calm center of this educational universe, even if internally you're occasionally screaming into a metaphorical pillow. By late afternoon, the children begin to tire. Attention wanes, tempers flicker, and your role shifts again. From instructor to emotional buffer, you soothe, redirect, occasionally deploy a well-timed story to regain focus. It's part pedagogy, part performance. And here's something rarely acknowledged. You are constantly being observed, not always directly, but always implicitly. The household watches. The parents evaluate. Even the servants notice. Your success is measured not just in the children's progress, but in your demeanor, your tone, your ability to exist without causing disruption. No pressure. As lessons conclude, you tidy the schoolroom, resetting it for tomorrow. Books aligned, chalk erased, chairs straightened. It's a small ritual, but it marks the end of your official duties for the day, at least on paper. In reality, your role lingers. You may be called upon for evening reading or to accompany the children during quiet activities. You remain available, present, and politely engaged. Dinner approaches again, and with it, the same careful navigation of social space. You've learned a little more now, when to speak, when to listen, how to occupy your seat without drawing attention or disappearing entirely. It's a strange dance, this life of yours. Structured, repetitive, and filled with expectations that are rarely spoken aloud, but always understood. As the evening winds down, you feel the weight of the day settle into your shoulders. Not exhaustion exactly, but a kind of mental fatigue that comes from constant awareness, constant adjustment. You return to your room, close the door, and finally exhale. Tomorrow will be the same. Lessons, discipline, expectations. The slow routine continues, steady as that ever-ticking clock, and you somehow are already becoming part of it. The hours between lessons stretch in a way that feels oddly elastic, never quite free, never entirely occupied. You exist in the margins now, drifting through the house with a kind of careful invisibility that takes practice to perfect. It's not that anyone has told you to disappear exactly. It's just, after the morning's structured intensity, the sudden quiet feels almost suspicious. You find yourself walking slower, listening more. The house has its own rhythm, and you're beginning to pick up on it. The creak of a particular stair, the way doors are closed with subtle variations of meaning, the difference between a casual bell ring and one that signals urgency. It's like learning a language made entirely of small sounds and glances. You're not required in the kitchen, of course. That's firmly the domain of the servants, and while you're not above them, you're not quite among them either. Socially, you hover in a strange middle distance, too refined to scrub floors, too insignificant to join the family's inner circle. If Victorian society had a miscellaneous category, congratulations, you're it. A mainstream historical fact quietly underpins your experience. Governesses were often the only middle-class women living within aristocratic households, which created a unique kind of social isolation. You're educated, you have manners, you understand conversation, but you're also employed. That distinction matters more than anyone says out loud. You pass a pair of maids in the corridor. They nod politely, but there's a flicker of something else. Curiosity maybe, or caution. You're not one of them, and they know it. But you're also not quite above them in the way the family is. It's a delicate social puzzle, and everyone's trying not to drop a piece. So where do you go? Often, it's back to your room. That small, in-between space that's starting to feel like the only place where you can exist without performing. You sit at your desk, hands folded for a moment, unsure what to do with the rare absence of instruction. This is where the isolation settles in. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gently like dust. You realize that there's no one here you can speak to freely. Conversation, when it happens, is always filtered through roles and expectations. You can't gossip with the servants. You can't confide in the family. You are, in a very real sense, alone in a house full of people. Historians still argue whether this social limbo contributed significantly to the emotional strain many governesses reported, or whether it was simply one aspect of a broader Victorian emphasis on restraint and propriety. Either way, you feel it now, a quiet, persistent distance from everyone around you. To pass the time you might read. Books are both your tools and your refuge. You open one, letting the words carry you somewhere else, somewhere less structured. For a while, you're not a governess. You're a traveller, a thinker, a person with agency. But even here there's a limit. You can't lose yourself entirely. There's always the possibility of being called, of needing to reappear at a moment's notice. So you read with one ear tuned to the hallway, always half present in your own life. A quirky tidbit. Some governesses reportedly develop the habit of pacing their rooms in measured steps, not out of restlessness, but as a way to maintain a sense of control and routine during these unstructured hours. Think of it as the Victorian version of step counting, no smartwatch required, just existential necessity. Eventually, you venture out again. Perhaps a walk in the garden is permitted. The grounds are expansive, carefully maintained, and just wild enough at the edges to feel like a whisper of freedom. You walk along gravel paths, the crunch beneath your shoes oddly satisfying. Here, at least you can breathe a little differently. The air is cooler, the sky wider. You pass hedges trimmed into shapes that suggest someone had far too much time and a deep commitment to geometry. A fountain trickles nearby, its steady rhythm almost meditative. You're not entirely alone, of course. A gardener might be working in the distance, and you exchange a polite nod. It's one of the few interactions that feels uncomplicated. No social puzzle, no hidden expectations. Just two people acknowledging each other's presence in a shared space. You might sit on a bench, hands folded in your lap, and let your thoughts wander. This is where your inner world begins to take shape, not just as a refuge, but as a necessity. You replay conversations, imagine alternatives, construct little narratives that give you a sense of continuity beyond your daily duties. Because here's the thing, your life is structured around others, their schedules, their needs, their expectations. These quiet moments are the only time that truly belong to you, and even then, they're borrowed. You think about your past, your family, your education, the path that led you here. Many governesses came from genteel but financially strained backgrounds, which meant this role was less a choice and more a necessity. You're not here because it's ideal, you're here because it's viable. And yet, there's a part of you that still hopes for something more. Afternoon calls you back inside. The house feels different now, busier, more active. You slip back into your role with practiced ease, as though the brief interlude never happened, but it did. And it matters, because without those moments, those small pockets of solitude, you might lose track of yourself entirely. You'd become just the governess, the role, the function. Instead, you remain something slightly more complex, a person navigating a very specific kind of existence. Later, as you pass through the hallway again, you catch a glimpse of yourself in a mirror. It's a fleeting moment, but you pause. You look composed as always, but there's something else there too, a quiet awareness maybe, or a hint of something unspoken. You're adapting, not completely, not effortlessly, but steadily. The social limbo doesn't disappear. If anything, it becomes more defined. You learn its boundaries, its rhythms, its unspoken rules. You learn how to exist within it, without constantly questioning it. Well, almost without questioning it. There are still moments, like now, when you wonder what it would be like to belong fully somewhere, to sit at a table without calculating your position, to speak without measuring every word. But those thoughts are brief. They have to be, because the routine resumes, and you step back into it, carrying your quiet reflections with you like a hidden pocket of self. And somehow, that's enough to keep going, for now. Evening settles over the house with a softness that feels almost deceptive, as if the day is gently exhaling after hours of rigid structure. Lamps are lit one by one, casting warm pools of light that never quite reach the corners of the corridors. Shadows linger there, stretching long and quiet, much like your thoughts at this hour. This is when the world narrows again. Less about instruction, more about endurance. You've finished the formal lessons, but your role doesn't dissolve with the daylight. Instead, it shifts into something quieter, more internal. The children may call for a story, or you may be asked to supervise their reading. You sit nearby, voice calm and steady, guiding them through tales that feel far more adventurous than anything in your current reality. You read about distant lands, brave heroes, improbable coincidences. Occasionally, you wonder what it would be like to be the one stepping into those stories instead of narrating them. Then a child interrupts to ask why a dragon would guard gold, and you gently steer the conversation back on track, because philosophical debates about fictional reptiles are not in your job description. Or are they? Honestly, at this point it's unclear. A mainstream historical fact lingers beneath these moments. Many governesses were expected to instill not just knowledge, but moral character. You are shaping how these children think, behave, and interpret the world. It's a quiet kind of influence, subtle, persistent, and rarely acknowledged. Eventually, the children are sent off to bed, and you're left in that familiar in-between space once more, not quite dismissed, not entirely needed. You hover, waiting for the next cue, the next expectation. Sometimes you're invited to join the family in the drawing room. This is where things become particularly delicate. Conversation flows. Literature, politics, society. And you are expected to participate just enough to demonstrate intelligence, but not so much that you appear opinionated. It's like walking a conversational tightrope while holding a teacup. You listen more than you speak, offering the occasional comment that is thoughtful but safely neutral. You might reference a book, agree with a point, gently expand on a topic. All the while, you're aware of the subtle glances, the quiet assessments. Historians still argue whether governesses were truly accepted in these social settings or merely tolerated as a necessity of upbringing. From where you sit, teacup balanced carefully in your hand, the answer feels like a polite version of the latter. There's a peculiar tension in these moments. You are intellectually capable of engaging fully, perhaps even leading the discussion, but doing so would disrupt the carefully maintained hierarchy. So you hold back, editing yourself in real time, like a living manuscript under constant revision. A quirky tidbit: some governesses reportedly develop the habit of memorizing entire passages of literature, not just for teaching, but as a way to mentally escape during long evenings. Imagine sitting perfectly still while internally reciting poetry like a secret rebellion. It's the Victorian equivalent of zoning out during a meeting, except with better vocabulary. Eventually, you're excused. Not dismissed abruptly, but gently released, as though your presence has reached its acceptable limit for the evening. You rise, offer a polite goodnight, and retreat with quiet dignity. Back in your room, the atmosphere shifts completely. The door closes, and with it, the expectations, at least temporarily. You loosen your posture, exhale more fully, and allow yourself to exist without performance. This is your time. You light a small candle, its flame flickering just enough to make the room feel alive. You sit at your desk, and almost instinctively, your hand reaches for paper and pen, letters. They become your anchor. You write to family, to friends, to anyone who exists outside this carefully constructed world. Your words are measured, of course. You can't pour out every frustration or doubt. But you find ways to hint, to suggest, to express just enough truth to feel real. You describe the house, the children, the routine. You might even include a small joke, something light to balance the underlying weight. Humor becomes a subtle coping mechanism, gentle, understated, and entirely necessary. Today I spent 15 minutes explaining why ink is not a suitable medium for decorating one's hands. You might write, with a faint smile, because if you don't laugh, even quietly, you might start to feel the full gravity of your situation. You pause, pen hovering, and let your thoughts drift. This is where your inner world expands again. Through memory, imagination, and reflection, you replay moments from the day, not just what happened, but how it felt. The small victories, the subtle tensions, the things left unsaid. There's a kind of intimacy in this solitude. Not loneliness exactly, though that's certainly present, but a deeper awareness of yourself. You are learning who you are within these constraints, how you respond, how you adapt, and sometimes you surprise yourself. You notice a growing resilience, a quiet strength that wasn't as visible before. You are managing a complex role, navigating a layered social structure, and maintaining composure through it all. That's not nothing. Still, the longing remains. You think about connection, real, unfiltered conversation, about laughter that doesn't need to be moderated, about being seen not as a function, but as a person. Historians still argue whether the emotional lives of governesses were fully understood or documented, given the private nature of their struggles. Letters, diaries, fragments of writing, these are the clues left behind. And here you are, adding your own quiet record to that invisible archive. You fold the letter carefully, sealing it with a sense of completion. It will be sent tomorrow, joining countless others traveling slowly across distances, carrying pieces of your life with them. Before bed, you allow yourself a small indulgence, perhaps another page of a book, or a moment by the window, looking out at the darkened grounds. The garden you walked through earlier now feels different, quieter, almost secretive. The house too has changed. Without the bustle of the day, it reveals a softer side. Floorboards creak more gently, the air feels stiller, and for a moment, it almost feels like you're the only one here. Almost you prepare for sleep, the routine familiar already. Candle extinguished, curtains drawn, everything in its place. You lie down, the events of the day settling into memory. There's a strange comfort in the repetition, the predictability, the structure. It can be stifling, yes, but also stabilizing. You know what tomorrow will bring, more or less. Lessons, expectations, quiet moments in between. And within that, you find small ways to hold on to yourself. As you drift towards sleep, one thought lingers. Not heavy, not urgent, just present. You are still here, still thinking, still feeling, still quietly shaping your own experience within the boundaries set around you. And for now, that's enough to carry you into the next day. Night in the house feels different from evening, even though the transition is technically just a matter of hours and extinguished lamps. Evening still carries activity, soft conversations, final routines, the lingering presence of expectation. Night, however, belongs to silence, not absence exactly, but a thickened stillness, like the building itself has decided to pause and listen. You are awake in it again, not because you cannot sleep necessarily, but because your mind refuses to fully surrender to rest without first reviewing the day. It's become a habit now, this quiet accounting of moments, as though your thoughts are keeping inventory of your own existence. The candle on your desk burns low, its light trembling slightly, as if uncertain whether it should continue. Shadows stretch across the room in soft, uneven shapes. Your belongings sit neatly where you left them, but at this hour they feel different, less like possessions, more like anchors. You think back to the morning, the structured beginning, the careful dressing, the first steps into the schoolroom. It already feels distant, like it belongs to someone else who happens to share your name. A mainstream historical fact threads through your reflection. Governesses in Victorian households often worked extremely long hours, frequently from early morning lessons until late evening supervision, with minimal separation between personal and professional time. In many cases, there was no formal end to the workday in the modern sense, just shifting expectations until sleep finally intervened. That explains something about the way fatigue sits in your bones now. It's not just tiredness, it's continuity without interruption. You shift in your chair slightly, stretching your fingers, which still feel faintly ink-stained. The physical traces of the day are small but persistent. Chalk dust, paper edges, the posture you unconsciously held for hours while instructing, correcting, observing. You wonder if anyone else in the house is awake. Likely not. The children are asleep by now, tucked into routines you helped enforce. The family has retreated into private rooms. Even the servants, whose work often begins before dawn, are finally allowed their own version of silence. And yet you remain here, suspended in your own quiet hour. This is when thoughts become louder. You think about the children again, not as pupils but as developing personalities. The one who fidgets constantly, the one who stares too long out of windows, the one who learns quickly but resists correction with subtle defiance. You are shaping them in small, repetitive ways. Language, manners, habits. It is a slow kind of influence, almost invisible while it's happening. Historians still argue whether governesses had meaningful long-term impact on the intellectual development of upper-class children, or whether their role was largely constrained by parental expectations and social rigidity. From your perspective, lying here in half-darkness, the answer feels complicated. You are teaching them, yes, but within a frame that is already defined before you arrived. Still, there are moments, small ones, a correction that finally clicked, a sentence read without hesitation, a polite gesture performed without prompting. These feel like tiny victories, though no one writes them down. You think about your position again, that strange social limbo you inhabit. Not servant, not family, not quite guest. It's a role that requires constant adjustment, like standing on shifting ground while pretending it is solid. A quirky tidbit you once read about governesses' surfaces in your memory. Some were reportedly instructed not to sit in the same seating areas as family members even when no guests were present, as a subtle reinforcement of hierarchy. Imagine that chairs assigned emotional weight, furniture as well as social boundary. You let out a quiet breath at the thought. Even now, alone in your room, you can feel those invisible boundaries lingering as if the house itself has internalized them. You rise from the desk and walk slowly toward the window. Outside, the grounds are barely visible, washed in darkness and faint moonlight. The garden you walked through earlier is now indistinct, reduced to shapes and shadows. The fountain, if it's still running, is only audible, not visible. A soft suggestion of movement in the distance. There's something calming about it, despite everything. You rest your hand lightly on the window frame and allow yourself a moment of stillness. No instructions, no expectations, no eyes evaluating your posture or tone. Just you and the quiet. And yet even here, your mind doesn't fully rest. It continues its careful looping through the day, revisiting conversations, replaying tone, imagining alternative responses you could have given. It's not regret exactly, more like refinement. a constant internal editing process. You wonder if this is what adaptation feels like. Back at the desk, you notice the letter you wrote earlier. It sits neatly folded, waiting for departure tomorrow. You think about the journey it will take, through hands and roots and delays, before reaching its destination. It carries a version of you that is slightly softened, slightly curated, but still real. Letters are strange like that. They compress complexity into paper. You open a drawer and place it carefully inside, as if storing a small piece of your day. The house shifts subtly as the night deepens. Old buildings have their own nocturnal vocabulary. The creak of settling wood, the distant settling of air in chimneys, the occasional rustle that could be nothing or could be everything. You are learning which sounds matter, and which are just the house remembering itself. You sit again, but not with the intention of working now. This is something softer. A pause within a pause. You think about your future. It is not a dramatic question in your mind, not something urgent or panicked, more like a slow horizon that keeps changing shape depending on how you look at it. Will you remain here for years? Will there be a transition eventually? Another household, another set of children, another version of this same routine? Or will something shift entirely unexpectedly, as life sometimes does without asking permission? There is no clear answer, only possibility. Many governesses eventually moved between households, depending on circumstance, recommendation, and necessity. Some left the profession entirely, if marriage or family allowed it. Others remained within it for most of their working lives, becoming almost itinerant figures within upper-class education systems. You try to imagine yourself in each version of that future. One feels stable but repetitive, another feels uncertain but expansive. Neither feels fully real yet. For now, your life is this house, these routines, these children, these rooms, and strangely, that is enough to occupy you. You return to the bedside and sit for a moment, hands resting loosely in your lap. Sleep is approaching now, not as a command but as a gradual surrender. Your thoughts begin to soften at the edges. Before lying down, you consider the quiet strength you've been developing without fully noticing it. The ability to maintain composure under constant observation. The skill of navigating complex social boundaries without open conflict. The patience required to repeat lessons, corrections, instructions, day after day. None of it feels dramatic while it's happening, but taken together it forms something substantial. Historians still argue whether this kind of emotional endurance was typical of women in domestic educational roles, or whether governesses in particular experienced a heightened version due to their liminal status. From where you sit now, it feels less like a debate and more like lived texture, something felt rather than analysed. You lie down finally, the mattress familiar now in a way it wasn't before. The room is darker than it was earlier, candle fully extinguished, moonlight faintly outlining the edges of objects. Your breathing slows. The day settles into memory, not as a single event but as layers. Teaching, observing, waiting, adjusting, thinking. A rhythm that will repeat tomorrow and the day after that, and likely many days beyond. And yet, within that repetition you are still here, still aware, still quietly building a sense of self within the structure surrounding you. Semiv arrives gently, without ceremony, and the house continues to breathe around you, steady and old and unchanging, while you move forward through its days one careful step at a time. Strange beauty standards. People followed in the Renaissance. You drift forward from structured corsets and careful steps into a different kind of room, older, quieter, lit by the soft flicker of candlelight against stone walls. The air smells faintly of oils, herbs, and something metallic underneath it all. Here beauty is still everything, but the rules have shifted, not necessarily safer, just different. You sit before a polished mirror, slightly warped, just enough to make your reflection feel like a suggestion rather than a certainty. A small table rests beside you, arranged with jars, powders, and mixtures that look almost alchemical, which, to be fair, they kind of are. You reach for one. It's a pale powder, soft and fine, designed to lighten the skin, because in Renaissance Europe, a pale complexion is more than a preference. It's a statement. It signals wealth, status, and the very important fact that you do not spend your days laboring under the sun. Tanned skin? That's for people who work outside. You, on the other hand, are aiming for something closer to porcelain. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Pale skin was widely associated with nobility and high social standing during the Renaissance, particularly in places like Italy and England. It wasn't just aesthetic, it was social code, written directly onto the body. So you apply the powder. At first it feels harmless enough. A light dusting across your face, softening your features, muting natural tones into something more uniform. But then you notice the texture, slightly chalky, a bit too smooth, almost unnaturally so, because this isn't just any powder. Many of these cosmetics contained lead, yes, actual lead, the same material you definitely don't want anywhere near your body, let alone your skin. But here, it's part of the routine, a key ingredient in achieving that coveted pale look. You pause for a moment, brush still in hand, as that realization settles in. There's something oddly bold about a beauty routine that doubles as a long-term science experiment. Lead-based cosmetics, often referred to as Venetian cerus, were popular despite their known side effects. Over time, they could cause skin irritation, hair loss, and more serious health issues. The skin might initially appear smooth and pale, but prolonged use often led to damage that required, ironically, more makeup to conceal. It's a cycle. You apply a little more, watching your reflection shift further away from its natural state. The effect is striking, undeniably. Your face becomes a kind of canvas, controlled and curated, but underneath your skin feels off, a slight tightness, a dryness that wasn't there before. Easy to ignore, especially when the result looks so refined. Historians still argue whether users fully understood the long-term dangers of these cosmetics or simply accepted them as part of the pursuit of beauty. Either way, the powders remained popular for generations. You set the brush down and reach for another jar. This one contains a liquid, slightly cloudy, with a faintly sharp scent. It's meant to enhance the complexion further, to smooth and brighten. You hesitate, just briefly, then apply it anyway, because that's the pattern, isn't it? A small doubt, quickly overridden by expectation. The liquid cools against your skin, leaving behind a subtle sheen. For a moment it feels refreshing, then the scent lingers, a quiet reminder that this isn't exactly a natural blend of harmless ingredients. Some of these mixtures included vinegar, mercury, or other substances that could irritate or damage the skin over time. But again, the immediate effect is what matters. The long-term consequences are a future problem, and the future right now feels very far away. You lean closer to the mirror, examining the result. Your face is pale, almost luminous in the candlelight. It catches the glow in a way that feels intentional, crafted, beautiful by the standards of the time, but also fragile. You notice how the makeup settles into the smallest lines, how it creates a surface that looks smooth from a distance, but reveals its texture up close. It's a delicate balance. Apply too little, and the effect is lost. Apply too much, and it becomes obvious. Parisian matters. A quirky detail drifts into your awareness. Some Renaissance beauty recipes included ingredients like crushed pearls or even animal fats, believed to enhance the skin's appearance. It's a bit like turning your face into a very expensive, slightly questionable dessert topping. You can't help but admire the creativity. You sit back slightly, letting your face settle into its new presentation. There's a stillness here, a quiet moment where everything feels complete. And yet, you're aware of the cost, not in a dramatic, immediate way, but in the slow accumulation of small risks. Each application, each ingredient, each decision to prioritize appearance over comfort or safety. It's familiar in a way, different century, same pattern. You think back, briefly, to the corset, the way it shaped your body from the outside. This now shapes your appearance from the surface inward. Both require adjustment. Both demand a certain level of acceptance, and both are driven by the same underlying idea. That beauty is something to be achieved, even if it asks a little more from you than you expected. You tilt your head slightly, studying your reflection from a new angle. The candlelight catches your cheek, highlighting the pale finish, the smooth illusion. It's undeniably striking, but you can't quite forget what's beneath it, the ingredients, the effects, the quiet risks that come with every layer. You reach up, touching your cheek lightly. The surface feels different now, less like skin, more like something applied, constructed. And for a moment, you wonder what it would feel like to simply, not to leave your skin as it is, unaltered, uncorrected. But that thought doesn't linger long, because in this world, just like the one you left behind, appearance carries weight. It opens doors, shapes perception, defines how you're seen, and being seen matters. So you adjust your posture slightly, letting the image settle into place. The pale face, the composed expression, the careful balance of art and risk. And as you sit there, illuminated by candlelight, you realize something quietly consistent across time. The pursuit of beauty doesn't always shout its dangers. Sometimes it whispers them, softly, persistently. Just beneath the surface, the pale finish settles on your skin, and for a moment, everything feels still, controlled, composed exactly as intended. But then your gaze drifts upward, toward your hairline, and you realize the transformation isn't finished. Not even close, because in this world, beauty isn't just about what you add, it's also about what you remove. You lean closer to the mirror, studying your reflection with a more critical eye now. Your forehead, perfectly normal by any modern standard, suddenly feels insufficient, too low, too ordinary. In the Renaissance, a high forehead is considered a mark of intelligence, elegance, and refinement. It's not just a physical trait, it's a signal, a visual cue that places you within a certain ideal. And if nature didn't provide it, well, you make adjustments. You reach up, fingers brushing along your hairline, imagining where it should be. Slightly higher, smoother, more expansive. The goal is a kind of open, luminous space above the brows, one that frames the face in a way that suggests both beauty and intellect. There are tools for this. Of course, there are tweezers, small blades, even chemical depilatories made from mixtures that are, let's say, not particularly gentle. You pick up a pair of tweezers now, feeling their cool metal edges between your fingers. This is where precision becomes personal. You begin slowly, removing individual hairs along the hairline. Each one is a tiny adjustment, a step toward that idealized shape. Just a sharp, brief sensation. Manageable, but repetition changes things. One hair becomes 10, 10 becomes 50. The area grows sensitive, the skin slightly irritated. You pause, just for a second, then continue. Because stopping halfway would leave you in an awkward in-between state, and that's not part of the plan. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Both women and some men in the Renaissance actively altered their hairlines, plucking or shaving to achieve the fashionable high forehead. It wasn't unusual, it was expected in certain circles. You lean back slightly, assessing the progress. The difference is subtle, but noticeable. Your forehead appears larger, your features more elongated. It changes the balance of your face in a way that feels intentional, but also a bit unsettling, because you're not just styling your hair, you're reshaping your identity. Historians still argue whether this trend was purely aesthetic or tied more deeply to ideas about intellect and virtue. A higher forehead was often associated with a larger brain, and therefore greater intelligence, an assumption that feels a bit optimistic, scientifically speaking. If that were true, modern exam prep would look very different and involve a lot more tweezers. You set them down for a moment, giving your skin a brief rest. There's a faint redness along the hairline now, a quiet reminder that beauty, once again, asks for a little discomfort. But the hairline isn't the only area under scrutiny. Your eyebrows come next. In some Renaissance styles, they're thinned dramatically, or even removed entirely. The goal isn't bold definition, but softness, subtlety, a kind of understated presence that doesn't distract from the overall harmony of the face. You consider this for a moment, looking at your brows in the mirror. They frame your eyes, give expression, structure, and yet, here, they're seen as something to be minimized. You reach for the tweezers again. Carefully, you begin shaping them, reducing their fullness, refining their edges. It's a delicate process. Too much, and you lose the natural balance. Too little, and the effect isn't achieved. Some went further, removing eyebrows completely and drawing them back in higher up on the forehead. It's a bold choice, one that requires both confidence and a steady hand. You pause mid-motion, imagining that look. It's striking in its own way, almost otherworldly, but also slightly disorienting, like a face that's been subtly rearranged, a quirky detail surfaces. Some individuals use mixtures containing quicklime or other caustic substances to remove hair more efficiently. Effective? Yes. Gentle? Not even remotely. It's essentially a chemical negotiation with your own skin, and your skin is not thrilled about it. You wince slightly at the thought and decide to stick with the slower method. Even so, the area feels sensitive now, the skin reacting to the repeated attention. You dab it lightly, trying to soothe the irritation. It's a small act of care in the middle of a process that doesn't always prioritize comfort. And yet, there's a strange satisfaction in the result. You look at your reflection again. The higher forehead, the refined brows, it all comes together into a look that feels distinctly Renaissance. Elegant, composed, just a little distant. It's a different kind of beauty than the one you experienced earlier. Less about structure and more about illusion. Less about shaping the body and more about editing the face. But the underlying pattern remains the same. Adjustment, adaptation, acceptance. You sit there for a moment, letting your expression settle into something neutral, something controlled. The mirror reflects back a version of you that fits the expectations of this time and place. And just like before, it looks effortless. But you know better, because you felt every small pull, every adjustment, every moment of hesitation. You know how much intention went into creating this image, and how easily that effort disappears once the final look is achieved. You run your fingers lightly along your hairline, careful not to disturb the work you've just done. The skin is still slightly tender, a quiet reminder beneath the surface. It's not dramatic. It doesn't demand attention, but it's there. And as you sit in the soft candlelight, your reflection steady and composed, you realize something that feels increasingly familiar. Beauty, in this world, isn't just about enhancement. It's about control over appearance, over perception, over the smallest details that shape how you're seen. Even if that control comes at the cost of comfort, even if it asks you to reshape parts of yourself, literally, you take one last look, committing the image to memory. The high forehead, the softened brows, the carefully constructed balance of features. And as you lean back, letting the moment settle, you can't help but notice how quiet the process has been. No loud warnings, no dramatic signals, just a series of small choices, each one bringing you closer to the ideal, and each one leaving its own subtle mark behind. Your reflection holds steady for a moment, pale skin, carefully adjusted hairline, softened brows, and just when it feels like the transformation might be complete, your attention shifts again. Not upward this time, but outward, to the shape of the body itself. Because here, beauty isn't only painted onto the face or refined along the edges. It's embodied, quite literally, in the way your figure occupies space. You straighten slightly, becoming aware of your silhouette in a new way. Not constrained like before, not sculpted by rigid structure, but still very much defined by expectation. And the expectation in many parts of the Renaissance world is full, not carelessness, but a soft, rounded presence that suggests health, fertility, and perhaps most importantly, wealth. A mainstream historical fact settles in. In Renaissance Europe, particularly among the upper classes, a fuller figure was often considered attractive because it indicated access to abundant food and a life free from manual labor. Thinness, by contrast, could be associated with poverty or illness. You shift your weight slightly, imagining how your body would be perceived through that lens. Every curve becomes a signal, every line a quiet message about your place in society. It's not about indulgence, it's about symbolism. You picture the paintings of the time, figures with soft stomachs, rounded arms, gentle fullness in the face. There's a warmth to it, a sense of vitality. The body isn't minimized or hidden, it's displayed, celebrated, even emphasized. But like everything else tonight, there's a layer beneath the surface, because achieving and maintaining that ideal isn't always as effortless as it appears on canvas. You move toward a table where food has been set out, rich breads, cheeses, perhaps sweet pastries. The kind of fare that supports this vision of abundance. You take a small bite, then another, aware that your relationship with food here is subtly different. It's not just nourishment, it's presentation. There's a quiet encouragement to maintain that softness, to avoid appearing too lean, too sharp. But at the same time, excess carries its own risks. Health, as always, exists somewhere in the balance. But balance isn't always the focus. Historians still argue whether Renaissance beauty standards promoted genuinely healthier body types compared to later eras, or whether they simply replaced one set of pressures with another. Because even here, where fullness is admired, there are still expectations to meet, still an ideal to maintain. And ideals, as you've noticed, rarely come without effort. You sit for a moment, considering how the body becomes a kind of canvas, just like the face, just like the hairline. It's shaped not only by what you wear or apply, but by how you live, what you eat, how you're seen. A quirky detail surfaces. In some cases, individuals used padding beneath clothing to enhance certain areas of the body, creating the illusion of greater fullness or more desirable proportions. It's a subtle trick, a quiet bit of stagecraft, because sometimes even abundance is curated. You adjust your posture slightly, imagining how layers of clothing might interact with your natural shape. Fabrics drape differently over curves, catching light in softer ways, creating a silhouette that feels both natural and intentional. It's less rigid than the corseted form you experienced earlier, but no less deliberate. You become aware of how you hold yourself, shoulders relaxed, movements unhurried. There's a calmness to it, a sense of ease that complements the aesthetic. But like everything else tonight, that ease is partially constructed, because you're still aware of how you're seen, aware of how your body aligns or doesn't with the ideal, aware of the quiet pressure to fit within a certain range of appearance. You take another small bite, more thoughtfully this time. The food is rich, satisfying, but you can't quite separate the act of eating from the idea of being observed. It's a different kind of constraint, not physical like the corset, not immediate like the sting of tweezers, but persistent, a slow shaping of habits, choices, and self-perception. You lean back slightly, letting your body settle into the chair. There's a softness here, a kind of grounded presence that feels almost comforting, and in many ways it is. Compared to the rigid structures of other eras, this standard allows for a bit more natural variation, a bit more breathing room, literally and figuratively. But it's not without its own complications, because when beauty is tied to abundance, it can blur the line between health and expectation, between nourishment and performance. You glance down at your hands, resting in your lap, and notice how even stillness carries meaning. The way you sit, the way you move, the way your body exists in space, it all contributes to the image, and the image matters. You think again of those painted figures, captured in oil and light, their forms preserved as ideals. They don't show the process, the choices, the quiet negotiations behind the scenes. They simply present the result, just like the mirror. You look back at your reflection, seeing not just the pale face or the adjusted hairline, but the whole composition, the balance of features, the suggestion of softness, the overall impression of health and grace. It's a beautiful image, but you know now how much goes into it, not just in effort, but in mindset. Because to live within this standard, you have to internalize it, to see your body not just as it is, but as it should be, according to the expectations around you. And once that perspective takes hold, it shapes everything. You sit quietly for a moment, letting that realization settle. There's no dramatic shift, no sudden discomfort, just a deeper understanding of how beauty operates here. It's not imposed from the outside alone. It grows from within, shaped by culture, reinforced by observation, and maintained through daily choices. And as you breathe slowly, comfortably this time, you recognize something that feels both familiar and new. Even without tight laces or heavy layers, the pressure is still there, just softer, and perhaps, in its own way, just as powerful. The softness of your posture lingers, that quieter kind of pressure settling into the background like a low hum. And just when it feels like the expectations might ease a little, your attention shifts again, this time to the finer details, the smaller features, the ones that seem subtle at first but carry their own quiet rules. Your eyes catch the light in the mirror, reflecting the soft glow of the room. They look fine by most standards. But here, fine is rarely the goal. Enhancement is subtle, careful, and occasionally a bit questionable. You reach for a small container, its contents dark and slightly glossy. Kohl or something similar, used to define the eyes. You apply it gently along the lids, deepening the shape, giving your gaze more intensity. It works immediately. Your eyes appear larger, more expressive, framed in a way that draws attention without seeming excessive. It's a delicate balance. Too much, and it becomes theatrical. Too little, and it's barely noticeable. But this part feels relatively harmless, almost modern. And then you remember the other methods. Some individuals, particularly in Italy, used drops made from the belladonna plant to dilate their pupils. The effect was striking wide, luminous eyes that seemed almost hypnotic. The name itself, belladonna, means beautiful lady. Charming, right? Except belladonna is also toxic. Very toxic. You pause, imagining a drop of it being placed into your eye. The initial sensation, the slight blur, the way the pupil expands to let in more light. It would make your gaze appear softer, more inviting, exactly the effect desired. But it could also impair vision, cause sensitivity to light, and in higher doses, lead to serious health issues. Historians still argue how widespread this practice truly was, but the fact that it existed at all tells you something important about the priorities of the time. Vision, optional; aesthetic appeal, essential. Modern eye doctors everywhere just collectively flinched, and they're not even sure why. You set the container down, deciding your current level of eye enhancement is quite sufficient. Thank you. Your attention shifts downward now to your mouth. Teeth, lips, features that are constantly visible, constantly part of how you present yourself. You smile slightly at your reflection, then pause, because even here, there are expectations. Teeth in the Renaissance weren't always the gleaming white standard we're used to today. In fact, in some regions, darker teeth could indicate wealth, particularly in places where sugar consumption was high. Sugar was expensive, a luxury, so signs of its overuse, like tooth decay or discoloration, could paradoxically signal status. It's a strange reversal. You consider this for a moment, your smile fading into something more thoughtful. Because while the appearance might carry meaning, the experience behind it isn't exactly pleasant. Dental care at the time was limited, and issues like cavities or infections were common. And yet, the outward signal could still be interpreted as desirable. It's another example of how appearance and well-being don't always align. You reach for a small cloth, perhaps to dab at your lips, adding a hint of colour or moisture. Lip colour in this era was often subtle, derived from natural sources like berries or plant extracts. It adds a gentle contrast to the pale skin, a soft warmth that brings the face to life. This part feels almost soothing, but even here, there are risks. Some pigments could cause irritation, and the lack of regulation meant you never quite knew what you were applying. It's a quieter danger, less dramatic than lead or belladonna, but still present. A quirky detail drifts into your thoughts. Breath freshening in the Renaissance could involve chewing herbs like mint or anise, or even rinsing with wine-based solutions. It's practical in a way, but also a reminder that maintaining the illusion of freshness required constant effort. You exhale softly, becoming aware of how many small adjustments have gone into this process. Eyes, teeth, lips, each one shaped, enhanced, or managed to fit a certain expectation. Individually, they seem minor. Together, they form a system. You lean back slightly, letting your face relax for a moment. The muscles soften, the expression fades into something more natural. And for just a second, you catch a glimpse of yourself without all the careful control. It feels different, not worse, just less constructed. But that moment doesn't last long because the habits are already in place. The awareness, the adjustments, the subtle corrections, they return almost automatically. You sit up a bit straighter, refine your expression, bring everything back into alignment with what's expected. And once again, it looks effortless. That's the pattern, isn't it? Effort concealed beneath appearance. You glance around the room, imagining others going through similar routines, each person working quietly, carefully, to present a version of themselves that fits within the shared ideal. No one announces the process, they just show the result. Historians still argue whether these practices were driven more by personal desire or social pressure, but standing here, it feels like a blend of both. The desire to belong, to be seen as beautiful, to align with the standards of the time. It's powerful enough to make the risks feel secondary. You touch your cheek lightly again, feeling the layered textures, the powder, the slight dryness, the careful application of everything you've used. Your skin, your eyes, your features, they've all been shaped in small, deliberate ways. And now they tell a story of beauty, yes, but also of compromise. You take one last look at your reflection, the candlelight catching in your eyes, your lips softly defined, your expression composed. It's a complete image, convincing. elegant, entirely in line with what the world expects to see. And as you sit there, quietly holding that image in place, you realize something that feels almost inevitable now. Even the smallest details can carry the heaviest expectations. Everything has settled into place now. The pale skin, the adjusted hairline, the softened brows, the carefully enhanced eyes and lips, they all come together into a single composed image. You sit quietly for a moment, letting it exist without interference, like a painting that has finally reached its last brushstroke. And in that stillness, something becomes clear. This wasn't just a routine, it was a system. You rise slowly, your movements unhurried, and step into a larger space. Perhaps a hall, perhaps a gathering where others move just as gracefully, just as deliberately. The air carries soft voices, the rustle of fabric, the quiet awareness of being seen. Because just like before, this entire process only fully exists in the presence of others. Beauty here isn't private, it's performed. You pass by others who reflect the same standards. High foreheads, pale complexions, subtle expressions. No one looks rushed, no one looks uncertain. Everything appears effortless, even though you now know exactly how much effort is hidden beneath that surface. There's a shared understanding in the room. An agreement almost. We will present ourselves this way. We will maintain the illusion. We will not question it. At least not out loud. A mainstream historical fact settles into your thoughts. During the Renaissance, appearance was closely tied to social identity, particularly among the upper classes. Beauty wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about signaling education, wealth, and refinement. To meet these standards was to align yourself with a certain place in society. And to fall short, well, that carried consequences, not dramatic ones, perhaps, but subtle shifts in perception, in opportunity, in how you're received. And those subtle shifts can shape an entire life. You walk slowly through the space, aware of how your appearance interacts with the environment. The candlelight reflects off pale skin, highlights the smoothness, the careful symmetry. Your features, shaped and refined, become part of a larger visual language that everyone here understands. And you speak it fluently now. But fluency doesn't mean ease, because maintaining this image requires constant attention. The powders must be reapplied, the hairline maintained, the small details, eyes, lips, posture, all need quiet, ongoing care. It's not a one-time transformation. It's a continuous commitment. Historians still argue whether individuals of the time experienced this as empowering, an art form, a way of expressing identity, or as restrictive, a set of expectations that limited personal freedom. And as you move through this space, you can feel both sides of that argument. There's skill here, creativity, a deep understanding of how to shape appearance in subtle, effective ways. But there's also pressure to conform, to maintain, to prioritize how you look over how you feel. You pause near a window, the faint night air brushing against your skin. It's cooler here, quieter. For a moment, you're slightly removed from the center of attention, and the stillness allows your thoughts to settle. You think back to the beginning of this process, the powders, the tweezers, the careful adjustments. Each step seemed small on its own, manageable. But together, they form something much larger, a mindset, one that teaches you to see yourself through a specific lens, to evaluate, adjust, refine, to notice every detail that doesn't quite align with the ideal, and to correct it. Over time, that lens becomes second nature. You don't just follow the standard, you internalize it. A quirky detail drifts into your awareness. Some Renaissance beauty guides included detailed recipes and instructions, passed down or shared among social circles. It's a bit like an early version of a tutorial, except instead of 5 easy steps, it's more like 15 careful adjustments and a mild tolerance for risk. You almost smile at the thought, because despite everything, there's a kind of familiarity in it. The desire to improve, to present yourself well, to align with what's considered beautiful. It's not unique to this era. It just takes a different form here. You turn back toward the room, watching as others move through the same quiet performance. No one speaks of discomfort. No one acknowledges the risks. They simply exist within the system, just as you are now, and the system works. It produces beauty. It creates a shared aesthetic, a recognizable standard that defines the time and place. But it also asks for something in return: consistency, effort, acceptance of the small, persistent costs that come with maintaining the image. You take a slow breath, letting the air fill your lungs more freely than it did in that corset earlier. There's a subtle difference here. Less physical restriction, perhaps, but no less mental engagement, because the pressure hasn't disappeared, it's just changed shape. You glance at your reflection in the window, faint and slightly distorted by the glass. It shows you as you are now, composed, refined, entirely in line with the expectations of this world. And for a moment you wonder what it would look like to step outside that image, to let the powders fade, to leave the hairline untouched, to allow your features to exist without constant adjustment. But just like before, the thought doesn't linger, because the system is already in place, and stepping outside of it would mean more than just changing your appearance. It would mean changing how you're seen, and how you see yourself, so you remain where you are, within the carefully constructed balance of beauty and expectation. And as the candlelight flickers softly around you, illuminating faces that all follow the same quiet rules, you recognize something that feels both subtle and profound. The dangers here aren't loud, they don't demand attention, they don't interrupt the image, they simply exist beneath it, woven into the routines, the habits, the mindset itself, and as long as the image holds, they remain almost invisible. Peculiar ways. People preserved food before refrigeration. You step out of candlelit rooms and polished mirrors into something far more practical. Cool air, rough textures, and the unmistakable scent of food being kept alive just a little longer than nature intended. The shift is immediate. No more delicate powders or careful tweezing. Now it's survival, ingenuity, and a few methods that might make your modern refrigerator feel like a technological miracle. You stand in a simple storage space, part cellar, part pantry. The air is cooler here, but not by design in the way you're used to. It's just naturally shielded from the sun. Thick walls doing their best to hold on to whatever chill they can. Shelves line the space, filled with jars, sacks, and bundles of things that look preserved, or at least trying to be. You reach for a slab of meat hanging from a hook. It's firm, darker than fresh meat. Its surface slightly glossy with crystals, salt, lots of it. This is where it all begins. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Before refrigeration, salting was one of the most common and reliable methods of preserving food. Salt draws moisture out of meat and fish, creating an environment where bacteria struggle to survive. It's simple, effective, and crucially, doesn't require electricity or a user manual. You run your fingers lightly along the surface. It feels dry, almost leathery. Not exactly appetizing by modern standards, but it has one major advantage. It won't spoil anytime soon. You imagine the process. Fresh meat coated generously in salt, sometimes packed into barrels or layered between salt crystals. Over time, the moisture is pulled out, the texture changes, and what remains is something far more durable than its original form. Durable, but also very, very salty. You're going to need a lot of water later. Just emotionally prepare for that now. You set the meat back and move toward another section. Fish this time, similarly treated. In coastal regions, this method was essential. Fish spoils quickly, and without preservation, it would rarely travel far from where it was caught. Salting allowed it to be stored, transported, traded. It turned food into something portable, but also something that required preparation before eating. Soaking, rinsing, sometimes multiple steps, just to bring it back to a more edible state. It's less grab a snack and more commit to a process. You glance around, noticing how much of this space is dedicated to managing time. Everything here is about extending usefulness, pushing back against spoilage just enough to make it through the next season, the next journey, the next uncertain stretch. And salt is just the beginning. You move toward a corner where thin strips of meat hang in the air, gently swaying. These have been dried, possibly smoked as well. The texture is even firmer, the edges slightly curled. Drying removes moisture, just like salting, but through exposure to air and time. Smoking adds another layer. Flavor, yes, but also preservation. The smoke deposits compounds that help inhibit bacterial growth. It's a multi-step defense system. You lean closer, catching the faint, rich scent of smoke embedded in the meat. It's surprisingly pleasant. This method, at least, has a certain appeal. But it's not without its quirks. A quirky detail drifts into your awareness. In some regions, foods were smoked in enclosed spaces where the smoke was thick and constant. sometimes affecting not just the food but the people nearby. Imagine your entire living space gently marinating in smoke. Cozy maybe, slightly overwhelming, also yes. You step back, imagining that atmosphere, everything infused with that same persistent scent. Your clothes, your hair, your surroundings. You don't just eat smoked food, you become part of the process. There's also the matter of consistency. These methods rely heavily on conditions: temperature, humidity, airflow. Too much moisture and drying becomes ineffective. Too little control and spoilage can still occur. It's not a perfect system, it's a careful balancing act. Historians still argue whether these preservation techniques were as reliable as we sometimes assume, or whether people simply accepted a certain level of risk as part of daily life. Because even with salting and drying, things could go wrong. You pick up a small piece of dried meat, turning it in your hand. It looks stable, preserved, safe. But there's always that quiet question in the background. Is it still good? There's no expiration date here, no printed label. Just experience, observation, and a bit of trust. You set it back down, deciding that maybe you're not quite ready to test your instincts just yet. Your attention shifts again, this time to barrels stacked along the wall. You pry one open slightly, catching a glimpse of something submerged in liquid, brine, likely. Vegetables perhaps, cucumbers, cabbage, something along those lines. Salt again, but in a different form. Brining allows food to be submerged in a saltwater solution, preserving it while also changing its flavor and texture. It's a slower process, one that transforms the food over time. You dip a finger in the liquid, tasting just the smallest amount, sharp, salty, alive almost. This is preservation that doesn't just stop decay, it redirects it. Instead of spoiling, the food becomes something new, and that idea lingers as you look around the room. Because everything here is part of that same effort, to hold on to food just a little longer, to stretch resources, to navigate a world where freshness is fleeting and unpredictability is constant. You take a slow breath, the cool air filling your lungs, carrying with it the scents of salt, smoke and thyme. It's not glamorous, it's not delicate, but it's essential. And as you stand there, surrounded by these methods, simple, effective, occasionally questionable, you begin to see a pattern forming again, not just in how people preserved food, but in how they adapted to the limits around them. Because when you can't stop time, you learn how to work with it. The cool, salted air lingers as you move deeper into the space, but something shifts now, not in temperature but in activity. Where salting and drying felt controlled, almost static, this next method feels alive. You hear it before you fully notice it. A faint bubbling, soft, irregular, like something quietly working beneath the surface. You turn toward the sound and find a cluster of jars and crocks, each sealed but not entirely silent. Inside them something is happening, not spoiling, transforming. You crouch slightly, peering into one of the containers. The lid lifts with a gentle resistance, and as it opens, a distinct smell escapes. Sharp, sour, almost tangy enough to make your eyes narrow just a bit. Fermentation. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Fermentation has been used for thousands of years to preserve food, relying on beneficial microorganisms to convert sugars into acids, alcohol, or gases, creating an environment where harmful bacteria struggle to survive. In simpler terms, you let tiny invisible helpers take over, and hope they're the friendly kind. You lean closer, studying the contents. Vegetables submerged in liquid. Cabbage, perhaps, slowly becoming something like sauerkraut. Or cucumbers turning into pickles. The textures have changed, softened slightly. The colors deepened. It doesn't look spoiled, but it definitely doesn't look fresh either. You take a cautious breath. The scent is stronger now. Sour, yes, but not unpleasant. Just assertive. Like the food has developed a personality and isn't afraid to show it. If flavors had volume controls, this would be set somewhere between confident and unnecessarily loud. You dip a small utensil into the mixture, lifting a piece carefully. It glistens slightly, coated in the briny, acidic liquid. You hesitate for a moment. This is the point where trust becomes important, because fermentation is a bit of a gamble correctly. It preserves food, enhances flavor, even adds nutritional benefits. Done incorrectly, well, let's just say you'd rather not find out the hard way. Historians still argue whether people of the past had a precise understanding of the science behind fermentation, or simply relied on tradition and observation. Recipes were passed down, methods repeated, results expected, but the microscopic details remained a mystery for a long time. The taste is immediate. Sharp, tangy, complex. It's not subtle, but it's undeniably interesting. Your mouth reacts before your brain fully processes it, adjusting to the acidity, the unfamiliar depth of flavor. It's preserved, yes, but also transformed. That's the key difference here. Salting and drying slow things down. Fermentation changes the direction entirely. It takes something perishable and turns it into something new. You set the utensil down, considering what you've just tasted. It's not just about survival anymore. It's about adaptation through transformation. You move to another container, this one larger, heavier. The lid is sealed more tightly, but you manage to open it with a bit of effort. Inside, a different scene unfolds. Liquid again, but darker, richer. Perhaps an early form of fermented beverage, wine, beer, something along those lines. Because fermentation isn't limited to preserving solid food. It extends into drinks as well. Grains, fruits, all undergoing the same process of controlled change. You lift the container slightly, catching the aroma. It's deeper than before, more complex, with hints of sweetness beneath the sharpness. There's a certain confidence in this method, a willingness to let time and microorganisms take the lead. But that confidence comes with risk. A quirky detail surfaces. In some cases, fermentation vessels would build up pressure from gases produced during the process, occasionally leading to lids popping off or containers cracking. It's the historical equivalent of your food literally saying, "I have thoughts about this situation." You glance at the jars around you with a bit more respect now. These aren't just passive storage units. They're active participants. You notice how carefully they're arranged, sealed, monitored, placed in cooler areas to control the pace of fermentation. There's an art to it, a balance between letting the process happen and keeping it within safe limits. Too much heat, and things can go wrong. Too little control, and unwanted bacteria might take over. It's not exact, it's experienced. You imagine the people who manage this process, checking on their stores regularly, relying on smell, taste, and appearance to judge whether something was progressing correctly. No thermometers, no pH meters, just intuition built over time, and maybe a bit of luck. You take another slow breath, letting the sour scent settle into something more familiar. It's no longer surprising, it's expected. That's another pattern, isn't it? What once felt strange becomes normal with enough exposure. You move through the space again, noticing how many variations of this method exist. Different vegetables, different liquids, different durations, all leading to slightly different results. Each one a small experiment, each one a negotiation with time and biology. You pause, resting your hand lightly on one of the jars. There's a faint warmth to it, a subtle sign that something is happening inside. Not visible, not dramatic, but constant. And that's what makes fermentation both fascinating and slightly unsettling, because it's never truly still. Even now, even as you stand there, the process continues. Sugars breaking down, acids forming, flavors evolving. It doesn't stop until it's done. And sometimes knowing exactly when that is part of the challenge. You step back, giving the jars their space, their time to continue whatever quiet work they're doing. And as you move away, the faint bubbling sound follows you, soft and steady, a reminder that preservation, in this world, isn't always about stopping change. Sometimes, it's about guiding it. The soft bubbling fades behind you, but the idea of time quietly working on food lingers as you move deeper into this world of preservation. Now the air grows cooler again, earthier, heavier, carrying that unmistakable scent of soil and stillness. You step down slightly into a lower space, underground. This is where things are hidden, stored away not just from heat but from sight. Because sometimes, the best way to preserve food is simply to leave it alone. You run your hand along a rough wall of packed earth. It's cool to the touch, naturally insulated, holding a steady temperature no matter what chaos the seasons might be causing above ground. This is the quiet advantage of going underground. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Root cellars and underground storage pits were widely used across many cultures to preserve vegetables, fruits, and even dairy products by taking advantage of the Earth's stable, cool environment. No salt, no smoke, no bubbling jars, Just patience. You walk further in, noticing rows of stored items: potatoes, turnips, carrots, apples. They're arranged carefully, spaced just enough to allow air to move between them. Nothing is rushed here. Everything is meant to last. You pick up a potato, turning it slowly in your hand. It looks normal, maybe slightly rougher than what you're used to, but intact. Solid, that's the goal. Preservation without transformation. But it's not as simple as placing food underground and forgetting about it. There's a balance to maintain. Too much moisture and things begin to rot. Too little and they dry out. Airflow matters, placement matters. Even the way items are stacked can make a difference. It's quiet work. Careful work. You set the potato back down and move toward a corner where something more unusual catches your attention. A container, sealed, partially buried, its lid secured tightly. You crouch beside it, curiosity pulling you closer. This is a different approach. Not just storing food, but sealing it away entirely. You loosen the lid slightly, and a faint, contained scent escapes. Something aged, something altered by time, but not in the same way as fermentation. This feels more dormant. A quirky detail drifts into your awareness. In some cultures, foods were intentionally buried for extended periods, sometimes months, sometimes longer, to preserve them or develop unique flavors. In certain cases, fish or meat would be wrapped and left underground, relying on cold temperatures and limited oxygen to slow decomposition. It's preservation by isolation. You pause, considering that idea, because it walks a very fine line between preserved and something else entirely. Historians still argue whether some of these buried food practices were driven purely by necessity or also by acquired taste, because while the method could extend the life of food, it also changed its flavor and texture in ways that not everyone would immediately appreciate. You imagine uncovering something that's been hidden for months. The anticipation, the uncertainty, the quiet question: is this going to be good or a very memorable mistake? Surprise fermentation is not a game you want to lose. You carefully reseal the container, deciding that some mysteries are best left to more experienced hands. As you stand, your attention shifts again. This time to hanging items stored in the cooler upper part of the cellar. Cheeses, perhaps, or other dairy products, wrapped and aging slowly. These too rely on controlled environments. Cool temperatures, steady conditions, time. You move closer, noticing how each item is positioned deliberately. Nothing touches the ground, air circulates. Everything is arranged to minimize risk while maximizing longevity. It's a system built on observation, trial and error, refined over generations. You run your fingers lightly along one of the shelves, feeling the slight dampness in the air. It's not unpleasant, just present. A reminder that this space is alive in its own quiet way, interacting with everything stored within it. Even stillness, here, has texture. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air settle in your lungs. It feels different from the spaces above, heavier, calmer, almost insulated from time itself. And in a way it is, because down here time moves differently, not faster or slower, but more predictably. Food doesn't change dramatically. It doesn't transform in bold, noticeable ways. It simply endures, as long as the conditions are right. And that's the key, because when those conditions shift, when moisture increases, when airflow is disrupted, when something goes unnoticed for too long, the entire system can begin to fail. Rot sets in quietly. Mold appears without announcement. One item spoils, and if you're not careful, it can affect the others. It's a delicate balance, one that requires attention, even in a place designed for stillness. You walk slowly through the cellar, taking in the quiet arrangement of everything around you. It's less dramatic than the bubbling jars, less immediate than the salted meats, but no less important. This is preservation through patience, through understanding the environment, through working with what the earth naturally provides. You pause near the entrance, looking back once more at the rows of stored food, the buried containers, the hanging items gently swaying in the cool air. It all feels calm, but beneath that calm there's a constant awareness, a need to check, to monitor, to ensure that everything remains as it should be. Because here, more than anywhere else, the line between success and failure is thin, and often invisible, until it isn't. You take one final breath of the cool, earthy air, then turn to leave the cellar behind. And as you step back toward the world above, you carry with you a quiet understanding. Sometimes the most effective way to preserve something is simply to trust the ground beneath your feet. You leave the cool hush of the cellar behind, stepping back into a space that feels warmer, brighter, less hidden, but no less deliberate. The air here carries a different scent now. Not earthy or smoky, not sharp with fermentation, but something softer, sweeter. You follow it instinctively. A table rests nearby, scattered with fruits, apples, figs, berries, alongside jars of thick golden liquid that catches the light like something almost too perfect to be practical. Honey. At first glance, this feels like a gentler approach to preservation. Less harsh than salt, less unpredictable than fermentation. Just sweetness, coating and protecting what lies beneath. And in many ways, that's exactly what it is. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Honey has natural antimicrobial properties and has been used for thousands of years to preserve fruits and other foods by creating an environment where bacteria struggle to grow. You pick up a small jar, tilting it slightly. The honey moves slowly, almost reluctantly, its thickness giving it a sense of permanence. It doesn't rush. It doesn't spoil easily. It endures. You dip a spoon into it, lifting a piece of fruit that's been submerged, perhaps a fig now glistening under its sweet coating. It looks inviting, transformed not by removal or decay, but by addition. You take a small bite. The sweetness is immediate, rich, almost overwhelming at first. The fruit beneath is softer, infused with the honey's flavor, preserved in a way that feels indulgent rather than purely practical. This is preservation that leans toward pleasure. If salting was survival mode, this is definitely, we're doing okay and we'd like dessert. But even here, there's more beneath the surface. Sugar, whether from honey or later from refined sources, does more than just sweeten. It binds with water, reducing the moisture available for microorganisms to grow. It's a different kind of barrier, one that works quietly but effectively. You set the jar down, noticing others nearby. Some contain fruit suspended in thick syrups, others more solid mixtures, early versions of jams or preserves. The textures vary, but the principle remains the same. Surround the food with sweetness, and you slow down the forces that would otherwise break it down. It's clever, admittedly quite enjoyable, but it's not without its own complications. Historians still argue whether the increased use of sugar in preservation, especially as it became more widely available, had unintended health consequences. While it extended the shelf life of food, it also introduced higher levels of sugar into diets, which could contribute to issues like dental decay or other long-term effects. You glance back at your reflection in a nearby polished surface, remembering that earlier thought about teeth and sugar. There's a quiet connection here, between preservation and appearance, between what you eat and how it shows. Everything links eventually. You move along the table, examining different methods. Some fruits are dried first, then coated in honey. Others are cooked down with sugar into thicker preserves. Each variation offers a slightly different result. Texture, flavor, longevity. It's experimentation again, but with a sweeter outcome, a quirky detail surfaces. In some cases, people used honey to preserve not just fruit, but even small animals or unusual items, relying on its antibacterial properties to keep them intact. It's effective, yes, but also a little unsettling when you think about it for more than a second. You pause mid-step, deciding not to imagine that too vividly. Some doors are best left gently closed. You pick up another jar, this one containing something more solid, perhaps an early confection, fruit thickened with sugar into a paste-like consistency. It holds its shape, dense and rich. You press lightly against it with a spoon. It resists, then yields slowly. This is preservation that borders on transformation again. Not as active as fermentation, but still altering the original form into something new, something longer lasting. You take a small taste. It's sweet, of course, but also concentrated. The flavor of the fruit is intensified, distilled into something more potent. It's less about freshness and more about memory, capturing the essence of the fruit and holding on to it beyond its natural season. And that idea lingers with you, because preservation in all its forms is really about that, holding on to something that would otherwise pass. You set the jar down gently, noticing how the light catches the surface of the honey again. It glows softly, almost reassuringly. This method feels safer, more controlled. But you know better now. Every method carries its own risks, its own trade-offs. too much moisture and even honey can fail. Improper sealing and contamination can still occur. And of course, the long-term effects of consuming large amounts of sugar, well, those don't always announce themselves immediately. Nothing here is perfect, just different ways of managing imperfection. You take a step back, looking at the table as a whole. The fruits, the jars, the golden sheen of preserved sweetness, it's a contrast to everything you've seen so far. Less about endurance, more about enjoyment, but still rooted in the same need, to make food last. You breathe in the sweet scent, letting it settle into something familiar, something almost comforting. And as you stand there, surrounded by these carefully preserved moments of flavor, you realize something quietly consistent across all these methods. Whether through salt, smoke, earth, or sweetness, every attempt to preserve food is really an attempt to hold on to time just a little longer. The sweetness lingers in the air as you step back from the table, but something in your mind has shifted. You've seen the methods now: salt, smoke, fermentation, earth, sugar. Each one clever, resourceful, even a little ingenious. And yet there's a quiet question that hasn't quite been answered. What happens when it doesn't work? You glance around the space again, this time with a slightly different perspective. The jars, the hanging meats, the buried stores, they all look stable, reliable. But now you notice the small details, the ones that don't quite fit the pattern. A jar pushed slightly to the side, a piece of meat that looks a bit too dark, a container sealed more tightly than the others, as if hiding something rather than protecting it. This is the other side of preservation, the part that doesn't make it into careful demonstrations or passed down recipes. Because sometimes, despite every effort, things go wrong. A mainstream historical fact settles in. Food spoilage was a constant risk before refrigeration, and foodborne illnesses were not uncommon, even when preservation methods were used. Without modern understanding of bacteria or consistent safety practices, people often relied on smell, taste, and experience to judge whether food was safe, which, as you might imagine, is not a perfect system. You approach one of the jars, its contents slightly cloudier than the others. You don't open it, you don't need to. There's a faint tension around it, a subtle sense that something inside didn't follow the intended path. Fermentation gone wrong, perhaps. Too much heat, the wrong balance, unwanted bacteria taking over. It's a reminder that these processes, while effective, are not guaranteed. They depend on conditions, timing, and a bit of luck. You move on, drawn toward a section where dried meats hang. Most look as they should, firm, preserved. But one piece stands out, its texture uneven, its color slightly off. You reach toward it, then stop, because you know what that means. Improper drying, moisture trapped where it shouldn't be. The perfect environment for spoilage to begin quietly, out of sight, until it becomes impossible to ignore. It looked fine yesterday, has probably ended many meals throughout history. You step back, a bit more cautious now, because the line between preserved and spoiled is thinner than it first appeared. Historians still argue how often people knowingly consumed food that was borderline or even unsafe, simply because alternatives were limited. When resources are scarce, the definition of good enough shifts. Risk becomes part of the calculation. You feel that tension now, not fear, exactly, but awareness. Every method you've seen tonight relies on judgment, on experience, on subtle cues that tell you whether something is still safe to eat. And those cues aren't always clear. You move toward the cellar entrance again, thinking of the buried foods below. Even there, where everything seemed calm and controlled, the same risks exist. Too much moisture, unnoticed spoilage, a container left too long. Time, the very thing these methods try to manage, is also what makes them uncertain. A quirky detail surfaces. In some cases, people developed strong tastes for foods that were partially spoiled by modern standards, fermented to the edge, aged beyond what you might expect. What was considered bad in one context could be perfectly matured in another. It's all about perspective and tolerance. You glance back at the honeyed fruits, the sweet preserves that felt so safe just moments ago. Even they aren't immune. Improper sealing, contamination, or simply time can shift them from preserved to spoiled. Nothing here is permanent, just extended. You take a slow breath, letting that realization settle in. The ingenuity of these methods is undeniable. They allowed people to survive, to store food through winters, to travel, to trade. but they also required constant judgment and a willingness to accept that sometimes things would go wrong. You imagine preparing a meal from these stores, selecting ingredients, inspecting them carefully, relying on your senses to guide you. It's a process that demands trust, not just in the methods, but in your own ability to read the signs. And even then, there are no guarantees. That's the quiet reality beneath all of this. Preservation isn't about certainty. It's about probability. You increase your chances of keeping food safe. You reduce the risks, but you never eliminate them in time. You walk slowly toward the exit, leaving behind the jars, the meats, the carefully arranged systems of survival. The air shifts again as you move away, becoming lighter, less burdened by the weight of stored time. And as you step out, you carry with you a deeper understanding, not just of how people preserved food, but of what it meant to live with that uncertainty every day, to eat with awareness, to store with care, to accept that sometimes, despite everything, the result might not be what you hoped for. You pause for a moment at the threshold, looking back one last time. Everything appears calm, ordered, reliable, but now you know better, because behind every preserved meal, there's a quiet risk and a quiet trust that it will be enough. The slow and cozy craft of medieval tapestry weaving. You step further inside and the quiet settles around you like a blanket. Not the awkward kind of silence. No, this is the good kind. The kind that lets your thoughts stretch out and yawn a little. Somewhere in the corner, a bundle of wool hangs like a sleepy cloud caught on a peg. The loom stands tall in front of you, all wood and tension and quiet purpose, like it knows it's important but doesn't feel the need to brag about it. You take a seat on a worn wooden bench. It's not exactly ergonomic. Your back will definitely have opinions later, but it's sturdy, dependable, and has probably outlived several kings. Medieval furniture really had that. I will outlast your entire bloodline energy. The workshop itself feels alive in a slow, patient way. You can almost imagine the rhythm of past days echoing here. Hands moving, threads tightening, hours slipping by unnoticed. Tapestry weaving in medieval Europe wasn't just a hobby you picked up after work. It was a full-time, full-body, full-soul commitment. Large workshops, especially in places like Flanders and France, employed teams of skilled artisans who spent months, sometimes years, on a single piece. Yes, years. Meanwhile, you sometimes hesitate to start a project that takes longer than a weekend. You lean forward slightly, running your fingers over a loose strand of wool. It's rougher than you expected, not soft like modern yarn. This is working wool, practical, durable, and stubborn in the way old things tend to be. It doesn't try to impress you. It just exists, ready to be shaped into something lasting. Historians still argue whether individual weavers felt a deep personal connection to each tapestry, or whether the work became more mechanical over time, especially in larger workshops. Standing here, though, it's hard to imagine this feeling like just a job. There's something about the slowness of it all that invites attention. You can't rush this. The loom would simply refuse. You glance up at it again. The vertical threads, called warp threads, are stretched tight, forming the skeleton of whatever will come next. They hum quietly with tension like a held breath. You don't hear it at first, but if you sit long enough, you start to sense it. A kind of stillness that isn't empty, just waiting. You reach out, gently pressing one of the threads. It doesn't give much. These threads are the backbone. Everything else will weave through them, over and under, again and again, until an image begins to appear. It's a bit like building a story one sentence at a time, except instead of words, you're using fibre, and instead of editing later, you just live with your mistakes forever. No pressure. A faint sound breaks the stillness, just the wind brushing against the outside wall. There are no machines humming here, no background noise except what nature provides. And that's part of what makes this craft so absorbing. You're not multitasking. You're not checking messages. You're here fully, with the loom, whether you like it or not. You shift slightly on the bench, already noticing how your legs are adjusting to the position. Medieval artisans didn't have the luxury of ergonomic chairs or standing desks. If your posture was off, well, you powered through. Consider it an early form of functional fitness, minus the gym membership and plus a lot more wool. In one corner, you notice a partially finished tapestry rolled carefully around a beam. Only a section is visible, muted colours forming what looks like the edge of a forest scene. Leaves, maybe, or stylized shapes that hint at something symbolic. Medieval tapestries weren't just decorative. They told stories, biblical scenes, heroic tales, hunting expeditions. If it could be imagined, it could be woven, a mainstream historical fact. Tapestries were incredibly valuable, often more so than paintings. They weren't just art, they were insulation. Thick woven walls helped to keep out drafts in cold stone castles. So while someone admired the craftsmanship, they were also quietly thinking, "Ah yes, less freezing tonight." Function and beauty, working together like an ancient power couple. You stand slowly and walk closer to the loom. The wood is smooth in some places, worn by years, decades, maybe centuries, of hands passing over it. You imagine the countless hours spent here, the repetition, the focus, the quiet satisfaction of seeing a pattern slowly emerge where there was once nothing. There's a small stool nearby, and on it rests a simple tool, a shuttle. You pick it up. It's lighter than it looks, shaped to carry thread across the loom. This little object will travel back and forth hundreds, thousands of times. It's basically the unsung hero of the operation. No one writes poems about the shuttle, but without it, nothing happens. Kind of like that one friend who organizes everything but never gets credit. You set it back down carefully. No need to get ahead of yourself. Tonight isn't about rushing into the weaving. It's about settling into the space, letting the rhythm find you. The light shifts slightly as time passes. You don't check a clock. There isn't one here anyway. Time in this workshop feels different, slower but not in a boring way. More like it stretches out, giving you room to breathe. You sit again, this time a little more comfortably. The initial stiffness fades as you adjust. Your hands rest loosely in your lap, and your eyes wander across the room. The wool bundles, the loom, the faint texture of stone walls. It all starts to feel familiar, like you've been here longer than you actually have. There's a quiet kind of comfort in that. Another small detail catches your attention, the subtle variation in the wool's colour. Even before dyeing, it isn't perfectly uniform. Some strands are lighter, some darker. It gives everything a slightly uneven look, but in a way that feels real. Perfect uniformity is a modern obsession. Here, variation is just part of the story. Historians still argue whether medieval weavers aimed for strict visual precision or embraced these natural irregularities as part of the aesthetic. Looking around, it feels like the latter. There's a kind of honesty in it. Nothing is pretending to be flawless. You lean back slightly, letting your shoulders relax. The workshop hums, not with sound but with presence. You can almost feel the slow accumulation of effort that defines this craft. Every thread placed, every pattern formed, every hour spent in quiet focus. It all adds up. And that's the thing about tapestry weaving. It doesn't reveal itself all at once. It unfolds slowly, deliberately, like a story that refuses to be rushed. You don't get instant results, you don't get quick wins. What you get is something deeper, the steady satisfaction of building something that will outlast you. No pressure, right? A faint smile crosses your face. There's something oddly reassuring about it. In a world that moves fast, well, faster than this, at least, this kind of slowness feels almost rebellious. You glance once more at the loom. Soon you'll start working with it. You'll prepare the threads, choose colours, begin the long process of weaving. But not yet. For now, you just sit, you breathe. You let the quiet settle in. And somewhere in that stillness, the work begins. Not with your hands, but with your attention. You don't rush. The workshop has already taught you that much. Instead, you lean forward slightly, letting your hands finally join the quiet conversation happening all around you. The loom waits, but before you can even think about weaving, there's something far more patient to attend to. Threads, fibres, and the slow preparation that quietly determines everything that follows. You reach for a bundle of raw wool hanging nearby. It's heavier than it looks, dense and faintly oily to the touch. Not unpleasant, just real. Sheep, fields, rain, and time all wrapped into one texture. Medieval wool wasn't processed into neat little skeins the way you might expect today. It began messy, tangled, and full of personality. A bit like your thoughts when you wake up too early. You pull a handful loose, teasing it apart gently. The fibres resist at first, clinging together in stubborn clumps. This is where the real work begins, long before any loom is involved. You have to prepare the wool, clean it, align, spin it into something usable. It's a reminder that every finished tapestry starts long before the first thread is woven, a mainstream historical fact. Wool was the dominant textile material in medieval Europe, especially in regions like England and Flanders, where the wool trade became a major economic force. Entire towns thrived on sheep, shearing and spinning. So as you sit here with your handful of fibers, you're holding something that once powered economies and shaped entire societies. No pressure again. You notice a pair of wooden tools resting on a nearby table. Simple carding paddles with rows of tiny metal hooks. You pick one up and run it lightly through the wool. The fibers begin to separate, aligning more smoothly with each pass. Back and forth, slow and steady. It's almost hypnotic. You fall into a rhythm without even realizing it. This part doesn't demand speed. It demands consistency. Each stroke is small, but it adds up. Kind of like doing laundry, except instead of clean clothes at the end, you get thread, and a deep appreciation for anyone who's ever done this full time. Once the fibers are softer and more uniform, you gather them into a loose roll. It's not perfect, but it's ready for the next step. You glance toward a spindle resting nearby, a simple wooden rod with a weighted base. No fancy machinery here, just gravity, motion and patience. You take a breath and begin to spin. Your fingers pull gently at the wool while your other hand sets the spindle in motion. It twirls, drawing the fibers into a thin, continuous thread. At first it feels awkward. The tension is tricky, too loose, and the thread falls apart. Too tight and it snaps. It's a delicate balance, like trying to pour tea without spilling while someone is watching you. Slightly stressful but manageable. You try again. Slower this time, the thread forms more cleanly now, twisting into something surprisingly strong. You guide it onto the spindle, watching it build layer by layer. There's a quiet satisfaction in seeing something take shape under your hands. No shortcuts, no automation, just you and the process. Historians still argue whether spinning was considered a skilled craft or a more routine task often delegated within households. Some evidence suggests it was both. An essential daily activity for many, yet also a refined skill in professional settings. Sitting here though, it feels like a bit of both. Simple in concept, but not easy to master. You pause for a moment, rolling your shoulders. Your hands already feel slightly different, more aware, more engaged. It's strange how quickly your body adapts when given a clear, steady task. Now, colour. You glance toward a set of small containers arranged along the wall. Inside them, bundles of dried plants, roots and powders. This is where the muted tones of medieval tapestries come from. No synthetic dyes here. Everything is pulled from nature, coaxed into colour through heat, time and a bit of guesswork. You kneel beside the containers, lifting one carefully. Inside, dried leaves crumble softly between your fingers. Another holds something deeper in tone, perhaps crushed roots. You don't need labels. The weaver who came before you likely knew these by heart. A quirky historical tidbit. One of the most prized dyes in medieval Europe came from a plant called woad, which produced a rich blue colour. It required fermentation, and yes, it smelled exactly as pleasant as you're imagining. So while the final tapestry might look elegant, the dyeing process probably had moments that were less luxury decor and more hold your breath and keep working. You move to a small hearth where a pot rests over low heat. Water simmers gently, barely making a sound. You add a handful of plant material, watching as the liquid slowly begins to change colour. It's subtle at first, just a tint, but over time, it deepens. Patience again. You dip a small length of spun thread into the mixture, holding it there. The colour seeps in gradually, uneven at first, then more consistently. You lift it out, letting excess liquid drip back into the pot. It's not a bright, modern hue. It's softer, earthier. Something that feels like it belongs in this room. You set the thread aside to dry, noticing how the light catches its surface. Even this early, there's variation, slight shifts in tone that give it character. Perfect uniform colour would come much later in history. Here, variation is part of the charm. Or, if you're feeling less poetic, part of the reality. You repeat the process with another batch, experimenting slightly. A longer soak, a different plant mixture. The results vary, and that's expected. Medieval dyeing wasn't an exact science. It was part knowledge, part intuition, and part, well, let's see what happens. You smile faintly. There's something freeing about that. As the dyed threads begin to accumulate, you hang them nearby. They sway gently in the air, catching the light like quiet banners. Each one represents time already spent. Minutes turning into hours, hours into something more. You step back and take it in. This is the foundation. Before the loom, before the patterns, before the finished tapestry that might one day hang in a grand hall, there's this raw material transformed slowly, carefully by hand. Another mainstream historical fact. In major tapestry centres like those in France and the Low Countries, the preparation of materials was often divided among specialists, spinners, dyers and weavers working together. So while you're experiencing it all at once, in reality, this process was often a collaborative effort. A quiet assembly line, but with far more patience and far fewer deadlines. You return to your seat, the workshop now feeling a little more familiar, a little more yours. Your hands rest again, but they're no longer idle. They carry the memory of movement, of texture, of small actions repeated with care. Historians still argue whether the subtle colour variations in medieval tapestries were intentional artistic choices, or simply the result of inconsistent dyeing methods. Sitting here, watching the threads dry in uneven shades, it feels like a bit of both. A limitation that became a feature, an imperfection that turned into style. You glance once more at the loom, now it feels different, less intimidating, more like the next step in a process you've already begun. The threads you've prepared will soon become part of it, woven into something larger than themselves. But not yet. There's still a quiet satisfaction in this stage, this slow gathering of materials, this careful preparation. It's the kind of work that doesn't demand attention, but rewards it if you give it freely. You lean back slightly, letting the moment settle. The workshop hums again softly, patiently. Nothing is rushed, nothing is forced, and somewhere between the spinning, the dyeing, and the quiet rhythm of your own breath, you begin to understand something simple but important. The tapestry doesn't start on the loom. It starts here, in the slow unseen work that no one talks about. But that makes everything else possible. Your hands don't hesitate this time. The threads are ready, spun, dyed, and quietly waiting. And now the loom no longer feels like a distant looming presence. It feels patient, like it's been expecting you to arrive at this exact moment all along. You shift forward on the bench, planting your feet more firmly on the uneven stone floor. The wood beneath your fingers is smooth in places, worn down by years of use and rough in others, where time hasn't quite polished it yet. You take a breath, not a dramatic one, just enough to settle yourself, and reach for the shuttle. It's lighter than you remember, or maybe your hands are steadier now. The warp threads stretch in front of you, vertical lines held under steady tension. They form a quiet grid, an invisible structure that will support everything you create. You gently separate a small section using a simple wooden rod, creating a narrow opening, the shed. It's a small space, but it's enough. You guide the shuttle through, left to right, smooth and careful, the threading itself across the warp like a single line in a much longer story. You pause, then reach for a beater, a flat comb-like tool, and press the thread into place. A soft, muted thud. It's not loud, but it's satisfying in a way that's hard to explain. Like closing a book gently after a good page, you repeat the motion. This time, right to left, settles, part of lace, gets pressed into place. Again and again. The rhythm builds slowly, almost without permission. Your hands begin to remember what your mind is still learning. There's something strangely comforting about it. No sudden decisions, no complex calculations, just repetition with purpose. It's the kind of task that lets your thoughts drift while your body stays anchored. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval tapestries were often woven from the backside, meaning the weaver didn't see the final image as it would appear when finished. Instead, they worked from a mirrored version of the design, guided by a full-scale drawing called a cartoon placed behind the loom. So as you sit here, weaving line by line, you're essentially trusting a pattern you can't fully see yet, which honestly feels like a metaphor someone would put on a motivational poster. You glance behind the loom, and sure enough, faint outlines of a design peek through. Shapes, lines, hints of some larger. You can't see it clearly from this angle, but it's there, guiding your hands without demanding your attention. You continue, pass, press, return, press. Your shoulders settle into the movement. Your breathing evens out. Time loosens its grip on you a little more with each repetition. Minutes blur gently into something softer. The first few rows don't look like much. just bands of colour, slightly uneven in places. You notice a small inconsistency. One thread sitting just a bit higher than the rest. You consider fixing it, then pause. Here's the thing. Fixing it would mean undoing several passes. Carefully pulling the thread back, reweaving, realigning. It's doable, but it takes time. And time in this workshop, but it is something you respect. You leave it, not out of laziness, but out of acceptance. A tiny imperfection in a much larger piece. It won't matter in the end, or it might become part of the character. Either way, it stays. Historians still argue whether medieval weavers corrected minor flaws meticulously or allowed small inconsistencies to remain, especially when working under time constraints. Given how slow this process is, you can see both sides, fix everything, and you might never finish. Let some things go, and the tapestry gains a kind of quiet honesty. You shift slightly on the bench. Your legs remind you that they exist, which is never a great sign. You adjust your posture, trying to find that sweet spot between comfort and functionality. Medieval ergonomics, once again, proving to be optimistic at best. You continue weaving, the colours begin to stack, forming subtle transitions. A darker thread here, a lighter one there. It's not a picture yet, but it's no longer random. There's direction now, intention. You reach for a different thread, slightly richer in tone, and begin a small section near the centre. This is where the pattern starts to take shape. You follow the faint lines of the cartoon behind the loom, adjusting your passes to match its contours. It requires more attention now. Instead of long, continuous passes across the entire width, you work in smaller segments, back and forth within a limited area, building up colour in one spot before moving on. It's slower, more deliberate. Each section grows like a patch of ground being carefully cultivated. You lean in closer, eyes narrowing slightly. Not in frustration, just focus. The world outside this loom fades a little more with each movement. The workshop, the walls, even the passage of time, they all soften into the background. There's only the thread, a quirky tidbit. Some medieval weavers reportedly developed such a strong sense of rhythm that they could work for hours with minimal breaks, guided almost entirely by muscle memory. Whether that's entirely accurate or slightly romanticized is up for debate. But sitting here, you can feel how it might happen. The repetition has a way of carrying you. Pass, press, adjust, repeat. At one point, the shuttle slips slightly in your hand, and you catch it just before it drops. Smooth recovery. You glance around instinctively, as if someone might have seen. They didn't. You're alone. The loom is not judging you, probably. You continue. The pattern becomes clearer now. A curve begins to form, part of a larger shape. Maybe a figure. Maybe a tree, maybe something symbolic that made perfect sense to someone centuries ago, and is now just slightly mysterious. Medieval art had that habit, layers of meaning that don't always translate neatly across time. Another mainstream historical fact, tapestries often depicted religious or mythological scenes, serving both decorative and educational purposes. In a time when many people couldn't read, these woven images told stories visually. So as you build this design thread by thread, you're not just making something beautiful. You're contributing to a form of storytelling that spans generations. No pressure. Again, you pause for a moment, letting your hands rest. The section you've worked on is small, but it's real. It exists now in a way it didn't before. That's the quiet reward of this craft. Progress you can see, even if it's slow. You run your fingers lightly over the woven surface. It's firm, textured, slightly uneven. Alive in a way that machine-made fabric rarely is. Each thread carries the memory of the movement that placed it. You lean back, stretching your shoulders carefully. A soft crack somewhere in your back reminds you that your body has limits, even if the loom does not. You smile faintly. Medieval weavers probably had a very different relationship with comfort, or maybe they just didn't have a choice. Historians still argue whether weaving sessions were structured with regular breaks, or driven by the demands of production, especially in larger workshops fulfilling commissions. Sitting here, it feels like a balance. You work until you need to stop, then you stop. Simple but not always easy. You return to the loom, the rhythm picks up again, familiar now. Less effort, more flow. Your hands move with a quiet confidence, guided by repetition and a growing sense of understanding. Thread by thread, the tapestry begins to emerge. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, patiently. And as you settle into the motion, you realize something almost comforting. You don't need to see the whole picture yet. It's enough to trust the next thread. You don't notice the shift at first. The rhythm is still there. Pass, press, return. But something subtle has changed. The threads are no longer just building structure. They're beginning to say something. The vague shapes you started earlier now lean toward meaning. A curve becomes intentional. A cluster of colours begins to resemble something familiar. You lean in slightly, eyes tracing the growing pattern. There it is. Not fully formed, not obvious, but enough to suggest a figure, perhaps part of a larger scene. A branch, maybe. Or the edge of a garment. Medieval designs rarely revealed themselves all at once. They unfolded slowly, like a secret that trusted you to stay patient. You adjust your grip on the shuttle and reach for a new thread. This one slightly deeper in tone. It feels different between your fingers, a little tighter, perhaps dyed longer. You guide it carefully through a smaller section of the warp, working in short passes. This is where weaving becomes less about rhythm and more about interpretation. You're no longer just following a pattern, you're translating it. Behind the loom, the faint outline of the cartoon continues to guide you, but it's not a strict instruction manual. It's more like a suggestion. Lines blur, details shift. You have to make decisions, small ones constantly. Do you blend this color here? Or keep it sharp? Do you extend this curve slightly? Or follow the original line exactly? No one is standing behind you with a checklist. It's just the threads, and a design that exists somewhere between intention and execution. Historians still argue whether medieval weavers had creative freedom in interpreting designs, or if they strictly followed the cartoons provided by artists. In larger workshops, especially those producing high-value commissions, precision was likely expected. But even then, the human hand introduces variation. Sitting here, you can feel it. Tiny choices shaping the outcome in ways no drawing could fully control. You continue weaving, this time switching between colors more frequently. A lighter thread to soften an edge, a darker one to define a boundary. It's slow work, but it's also deeply satisfying. Each change adds depth, like shading in a painting, a mainstream historical fact. Many famous medieval tapestries, such as those produced in the workshops of Flanders, were based on designs by well-known artists. The weavers translated these designs into textile form, often working from detailed cartoons. So while the final piece might be attributed to a master artist, the actual creation depended heavily on skilled weavers like you, though their names were rarely recorded. History, it seems, has always had a habit of spotlighting some roles while quietly overlooking others. You pause briefly, considering that. Then you return to the loom. Recognition isn't part of this process. Presence is. You shift slightly, adjusting your position as you focus on a more intricate section. The pattern here is tighter, requiring shorter passes and more frequent adjustments. Your fingers move carefully, guiding each thread into place. There's a moment where you misjudge the spacing. A small gap appears, just enough to catch your eye. You freeze for a second, staring at it. Well, that's new. You could leave it. It's small, barely noticeable. But now that you've seen it, it feels louder than it should. You sigh softly, not frustrated, just acknowledging the situation, and begin to undo the last few passes. It's delicate work, pulling the thread back without disturbing the surrounding area. A bit like trying to untangle headphones without making things worse. You go slowly. There. You reweave the section, this time with a little more care. The thread settles into place more evenly, and the gap disappears. You sit back slightly, satisfied. 3 seconds of error. 10 minutes of correction, a classic ratio. A faint smile crosses your face. As you continue, the image grows clearer. What was once a suggestion now begins to resemble something recognizable. A figure's outline emerges more distinctly. The folds of fabric, the suggestion of movement. It's all there, slowly taking shape. There's something almost magical about it. Not in a dramatic, sparkly way, but in a quiet, steady way. Like watching a photograph develop in slow motion, except you're the one creating it. A quirky historical tidbit. Some medieval tapestries included subtle details or hidden elements, small animals, symbolic objects, or even playful touches added by the weavers themselves. These weren't always part of the original design. Sometimes they were little signatures, quiet ways for artisans to leave a trace of themselves in a work that might otherwise remain anonymous. You glance at your growing tapestry, tempting. You imagine adding something the corner maybe, or a pattern that only you would notice. Nothing disruptive, just a whisper of individuality. You don't act on it, not yet, but the idea lingers. You continue weaving, your movements now more fluid. The earlier stiffness has faded, replaced by a kind of ease that comes from repetition. Your hands know what to do, your eyes guide them, but there's less hesitation now. Time, once again, becomes less defined. The light in the workshop shifts subtly, moving across the floor, climbing the wall, then softening as it changes angle. You don't track it consciously, but you feel it. The passage of time measured not in minutes, but in light and shadow. Another mainstream historical fact. Tapestries often served as portable displays of wealth and power. Nobles would transport them from one residence to another, hanging them in different halls as needed. So the piece you're working on might one day travel, rolled, carried, displayed in spaces far beyond this quiet workshop. You glance at it again. Strange to think something so still could move so much. Historians still argue whether the symbolic imagery in tapestries was always clearly understood by contemporary viewers, or if some meanings were already obscure, even in their own time. Looking at the design taking shape before you, you can see how that might happen. Layers of meaning, references, traditions, all woven together, some clear, some less so. You lean in, focusing on a particularly detailed section. The pattern here requires careful blending of colours, creating a gradient effect. You alternate threads more frequently. It's slow, very slow, but also calming. There's no rush, no deadline pressing down on you, just the steady accumulation of effort. Each thread placed with intention, each section built gradually. You pause again, this time not because something went wrong, but because something feels right. The section you've just completed, small as it is, holds together. The colours align, the shapes make sense, the texture feels consistent. It's a quiet success, the kind that doesn't need applause. You let yourself sit with that for a moment, then you continue, because the tapestry isn't finished, not even close. But it's no longer just a collection of threads, it's a story. And you're right in the middle of telling it, one careful, deliberate line at a time. You don't notice when it becomes something whole. Not all at once, anyway. There isn't a dramatic moment where you step back and suddenly, there it is, complete, perfect, ready to be admired. Instead, the tapestry reaches that point quietly, almost shyly. One more thread, one more small section, one last careful pass of the shuttle. And then, there's nothing left to add. Your hands pause mid-motion, as if waiting for the next instruction. But there isn't one. You sit there for a moment, the loom still in front of you, the threads now fully woven into something that didn't exist before you began. The pattern, once faint and uncertain, is now clear. Figures, shapes, colours, all layered together into a scene that feels both detailed and distant, like a memory you can't quite place. You lean back slowly, letting your shoulders drop. It's finished, or at least finished in the way things were finished here. Not flawless, not machine perfect, but complete, whole. Honest, a mainstream historical fact. Once a tapestry was fully woven, it didn't immediately leave the loom and head off to a castle wall. There were final steps, careful trimming, securing loose threads, sometimes adding a lining or reinforcing the edges. The finishing process ensured the tapestry could withstand being handled, transported and displayed for years, even decades. You reach forward, running your fingers lightly across the surface. It's firm, textured, slightly uneven in places. You can feel the work in it, the hours, the decisions, the small imperfections that quietly mark its creation. There's that one spot, near the lower edge, where you corrected a gap. You can still see it if you look closely. Not obvious, not distracting, just there. A reminder that this wasn't effortless. You smile faintly good. You wouldn't trust it if it looked too perfect. Historians still argue whether the value of a tapestry was judged more by its artistic design or by the quality of its materials and craftsmanship. Some patrons cared deeply about the imagery, the story it told, the symbolism it carried. Others focused on the richness of the threads, the fineness of the weave, the sheer labour embedded in every inch. Sitting here, it feels impossible to separate those things. The story and the making are intertwined. You stand slowly, your legs reminding you, once again, that they've been part of this journey whether they wanted to be or not. A careful stretch, a shift of weight, and you're upright, facing the loom from a new angle. From here, the tapestry looks different, not reversed, not fragmented, just itself. You take a step back, then another, the full scene comes into view. The colours, muted but rich, hold together in a way that feels grounded. Nothing shouts for attention, nothing tries too hard. It simply exists, confident in its own quiet way. You imagine where it might go next, a large stone hall perhaps, hung along a cold wall, softening the space, adding warmth both visually and physically. Medieval tapestries weren't just decoration, they were insulation. Thick woven layers that helped keep out drafts in drafty castles. So while someone might admire the artistry, they were also quietly appreciating the fact that their living space felt slightly less like a refrigerator. Functioning and beauty, working together again. You step closer to the edges, examining the finishing details. The threads are secured, the borders neat but not overly rigid. There's a flexibility to it, a sense that it can be moved, rolled, transported, and it will be. Another mainstream historical fact. Tapestries were often part of a travelling household. Nobles would carry them from one residence to another, using them to transform unfamiliar spaces into something more personal. So this piece, created in this quiet workshop, might one day hang in different rooms, different cities, even different regions. You rest your hand lightly against it. Strange to think it might outlast you. Centuries even. Historians still argue whether medieval weavers fully grasped the long-term legacy of their work, or if they focused more on immediate function and patron demands. Standing here, it feels like both could be true. You don't need to think about centuries to care about what you're making, but the possibility is there, woven quietly into every thread. You walk slowly around the loom, taking in the workshop one last time. It feels different now, not because the space has changed, but because you have. The loom is no longer just an object. It's something you've worked with, understood, spent time alongside. The tools, the threads, the quiet rhythm. They're familiar now. You return to the bench, sitting down one final time. The workshop hums softly, just as it did when you first arrived. The same light, the same stillness. But there's a subtle shift, a sense of completion, of something having passed through this space and left its mark. You let your hands rest in your lap, no thread to hold, no shuttle to guide, just stillness, a quirky historical tidbit. Some tapestries were so valued that they were listed in inventories alongside gold and silver, treated as portable wealth. Not bad for something made of wool and time. You glance once more at the finished piece. There's a temptation to focus on what you might have done differently. A slightly cleaner line here, a more precise colour transition there. But the thought fades quickly, because that's not the point. The tapestry isn't a collection of perfect decisions, it's a record of real ones, and now it's complete. Inside the slow ceremony of a Japanese tea gathering, you arrive quietly, almost without realizing when the outside world slipped away behind you. The air feels different here, softer, more deliberate. Even your footsteps seem to adjust on their own, becoming quieter, more careful, as if the ground itself expects a certain level of respect. There's a small path leading forward, simple stones set into the earth, guiding you one step at a time. You follow it instinctively, not too fast, definitely not rushed. Speed feels out of place here, like bringing loud music into a room that prefers silence, so you slow down. And as you do, something shifts, not just in your pace, but in your awareness. You notice the texture of the stones beneath your feet, the faint rustle of leaves nearby, the way the air carries just a hint of moisture. It's subtle, but it draws your attention inward. This is the beginning. A mainstream historical fact settles gently into your thoughts. The Japanese tea ceremony, or chanoyu, developed over centuries, deeply influenced by Zen Buddhism, and centered on principles like harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. You don't need to memorize those principles. You can feel them. At the end of the path, you reach a small entrance. It's lower than you expect. You instinctively bow as you step through, not out of obligation, but because it feels natural. The space invites humility. Inside, everything is minimal, not empty but intentional. A small room, tatami mats beneath your feet, soft light filtering in through paper screens. There's a stillness here that doesn't feel forced. It simply exists, like a quiet agreement between the space and everyone within it. You pause just inside the room, unsure for a moment where to look. There's so little here, and yet each element seems to carry weight. A scroll on the wall, a single flower arrangement, a kettle resting quietly, not yet in use. Nothing is random. A quirky detail drifts into your awareness. The design of tea rooms often emphasizes simplicity to such a degree that even the smallest imperfections, like a slightly uneven surface or a natural flaw in the materials, are appreciated as part of the aesthetic. It's a concept sometimes referred to as wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection. You glance at the room again, noticing those small irregularities. They don't feel like mistakes, they feel honest. You move carefully to where you're meant to sit, lowering yourself onto the tatami. The motion is slower than you're used to, more deliberate. Your body adjusts, settling into a posture that feels both grounded and slightly unfamiliar. There's no rush, no expectation to fill the silence. And that silence isn't empty, it's full of small sounds. The faint movement of fabric, the subtle shift of weight, the quiet presence of others who have entered just as you have, each one moving with the same careful attention. You become aware of your breathing, not in a forced way, just naturally. It slows, matching the rhythm of the space. If your usual day runs on notifications and deadlines, this feels like switching to airplane mode for your entire existence. You glance toward the host, who is present but not yet active. There's a calmness in their posture, a readiness that doesn't feel hurried. Everything here unfolds in its own time, and you're part of that unfolding now. Historians still argue whether the tea ceremony should be understood primarily as a spiritual practice, a social ritual, or an art form. Sitting here, it feels like all three at once. There's intention in every detail, but also a kind of openness. Space for interpretation, for personal experience. You shift slightly, adjusting your position. Even that small movement feels more noticeable here, more connected to the overall atmosphere. It's not that you're being watched, it's that you're more aware of yourself within the space. And that awareness is gentle, not critical, not demanding, just present. You look again at the scroll on the wall. The characters are simple, elegant. You may not fully understand their meaning, but that doesn't seem to matter. They're part of the environment, part of the mood. Everything here works together. The room, the objects, the people, the silence. It's not about any one element, it's about how they connect. You rest your hands lightly in your lap, feeling the texture of the tatami beneath you. The scent of the room is subtle. Wood, paper, a hint of something warm from the kettle. Time feels different here, not slower exactly, just less urgent. You're not waiting for something to happen. You're simply here at the beginning of a process that unfolds without rushing toward an end. And that might be the most unfamiliar part, because in most places there's a goal, a destination, a clear outcome. Here the experience itself is the point. You take another quiet breath, letting the stillness settle a little deeper. The outside world feels distant now, like something you can return to later, but not right now. Right now you're here, in this room, at the start of something slow, deliberate, and quietly meaningful. And as you sit there, surrounded by simplicity and intention, you begin to understand something that doesn't need to be explained out loud. This isn't just about tea. It's about learning how to be present, one careful step at a time. The stillness you've settled into doesn't break, it deepens. No sudden shift, no clear signal, just a subtle change in attention, like the room itself gently inhales and prepares to move forward. The host begins, it's almost imperceptible at first. A small adjustment of posture, a quiet reaching for the utensils. But immediately, the atmosphere shifts from stillness to intentional motion. Every action now has weight, purpose, and a rhythm that feels both practiced and unhurried. You watch closely, not because you're told to, but because it feels natural to do so. The first movements are about preparation, not of the tea, but of the space, the tools, and in a way the mind. The host handles each object with care. A cloth, a scoop, a bowl. Each item is lifted, turned, placed with a precision that feels almost meditative. Nothing is wasted, not a gesture, not a second. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness. The tea ceremony includes a series of prescribed movements that have been refined over generations, each one designed to embody respect, mindfulness, and efficiency. Efficiency, but not speed. That distinction becomes clear as you watch. The cloth fukusa is folded and unfolded in a specific way, used to symbolically purify the utensils, not because they're physically dirty, but because the act itself carries meaning. It marks a transition from ordinary use to ceremonial purpose. You follow the motion with your eyes, noticing how deliberate it is. The folds are exact, the timing consistent. It's almost like watching a quiet choreography, one that doesn't need music because the rhythm is already there. You become aware of your own posture again. You sit a little straighter, not out of obligation, but because the environment invites it. Your hands rest more deliberately, your movements more contained. The ceremony isn't asking you to change, it's simply influencing you. A quirky detail drifts into your thoughts. Many tea practitioners spend years learning these movements, repeating them until they become second nature. What looks simple on the surface is the result of deep practice and attention to detail. You watch the host clean the tea bowl now. The motion is slow, precise, almost reverent. The bowl is turned, inspected, wiped. It's not just an object. It's a focal point, something to be appreciated as much as used. You notice the texture, the shape, the slight imperfections that give it character. It's not perfectly symmetrical, and that seems intentional. There's a quiet beauty in its irregularity. Again, that idea of wabi-sabi returns. Beauty in imperfection, in transience, in things that are not overly polished. You feel it more clearly now. This isn't about perfection in the modern sense. It's about presence. Historians still argue whether the ritualized purification in the tea ceremony originated primarily from practical concerns or spiritual symbolism. But sitting here, it feels less like a question of origin and more like a lived experience. The act itself carries meaning regardless of how it began. You watch as the host prepares the water next. The kettle, which had been quietly present, now becomes active. There's a soft sound as it's handled, a gentle shift that draws your attention without breaking the calm. Even the sound feels intentional. Nothing is loud. Nothing is abrupt. Every noise blends into the atmosphere, becoming part of the overall experience rather than interrupting it. If this were your daily routine, even opening a snack bag would probably feel like a dramatic event. You almost smile at the thought, but it fades quickly into the quiet focus of the moment. The host continues, each movement flowing into the next. There's no hesitation, no wasted motion. It's not mechanical, it's fluid, like a series of gestures connected by intention rather than force. You begin to anticipate the rhythm, not predict it exactly, but sense its pattern. Fold, place, turn, pause. Pause is important. It gives space for each action to exist fully before the next begins. You realize how rare that is, how often actions in your usual day blur together, one leading into the next without acknowledgement. Here, each step is given its own moment, its own significance. You feel your breathing again, slow and steady, almost synchronized with the pace of the ceremony. It's not something you're trying to control. It just happens. The environment shapes it. You glance briefly at the other guests. They're just as still, just as attentive. No one speaks, no one shifts unnecessarily. It's a shared silence, not empty but full of quiet awareness. You're all participating, even in stillness. That's part of the ritual too. You return your focus to the host, who now completes the purification of the utensils. Everything is ready. The space feels prepared, not just physically but mentally. There's a sense of transition here, like crossing from one state into another. The everyday has been gently set aside, replaced by something more focused, more intentional. You sit a little deeper into that feeling, letting it settle. The room hasn't changed, but your experience of it has. And as the final preparatory movements come to a close, you sense that something is about to begin, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet intention that has guided every step so far. You don't rush ahead. You stay where you are, present, ready, because here, even the beginning of something is treated with care. The quiet preparation settles into a gentle pause, and without any clear signal, the next phase begins. You don't notice the exact moment it shifts, you just feel it. The space is ready now, the tools aligned, the atmosphere carefully shaped. Now, the tea itself enters the scene. The host reaches for the tea container, lifting it with the same measured care you've come to expect. Inside is powdered green tea, matcha fine, vibrant, almost luminous in its color. Even from where you sit, you can sense its presence, its importance. This is the heart of it. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness. Matcha, a finely ground powder of specially grown and processed green tea leaves, has been central to the Japanese tea ceremony for centuries, valued not only for its flavor but for its cultural and spiritual significance. You watch as the host opens the container, revealing the tea with a subtle, almost ceremonial reveal. There's no rush, no flourish, just a quiet acknowledgement of what's about to happen. A small scoop, chashaku, is used to measure the tea. The motion is precise, practiced. A measured amount is placed into the bowl, each scoop deliberate, consistent. You find yourself focusing on the smallest details. The angle of the wrist, the placement of the scoop, the sound it makes as it lightly touches the bowl. Nothing escapes your attention, and yet nothing demands it either. It's a natural kind of focus, drawn out by the calm, steady rhythm of the process. The host then lifts a ladle, hishaku, to draw hot water from the kettle. The movement is smooth, controlled. The water is poured into the bowl, meeting the tea powder with a soft, almost inaudible sound. You watch closely. This is where transformation happens, not through fermentation or time, like before, but instantly. In this single moment, powder and water become something new. The host takes up the whisk, chasen, and begins to mix the tea. The motion is quick but controlled, a gentle whisking that creates a fine foam on the surface. It's the most energetic movement you've seen so far, but even this carries a sense of calm precision. There's a rhythm to it, a quiet intensity. If your morning coffee routine looked like this, you'd probably be awake before the caffeine even had a chance. You almost expect the sound to be louder, but it isn't. Just a soft, consistent motion like a whisper repeated over and over. Historians still argue whether the specific technique used preparing matcha evolved primarily for taste or for aesthetic and ritual purposes. But watching it now, it feels like both are inseparable. The way it's made affects how it tastes and how it's experienced. The whisking slows, then stops. The tea is ready. You look into the bowl, noticing the surface. Smooth, slightly frothy, a deep green that seems almost alive in the soft light. It's simple, but it holds your attention completely. The host lifts the bowl and turns it slightly, aligning it in a specific way before presenting it. Even this small gesture carries intention. Nothing is accidental. The bowl is offered to the first guest. There's a subtle exchange, a bow, a careful receiving of the object. You watch closely, knowing that your turn will come, and already feeling the quiet responsibility of participating correctly. The guest lifts the bowl, turns it slightly before drinking, an act of respect, of acknowledgement. Then slowly, they take a sip. No rush, no distraction, just that single action, given full attention. You notice how the room seems to hold its breath for a moment. Not in tension, but in shared focus. Everyone is present for this simple act, drinking tea. And yet, it feels like more than that. A connection between host and guest, between movement and stillness, between prebble is passed along, each person repeating the same careful sequence. Receive, turn, drink, appreciate, return. It's a cycle, sibyl, repeated, meaningful. You feel your turn approaching. There's no anxiety, just awareness. You've been watching, learning, absorbing the rhythm. Your body already understands what to do, even if your mind hasn't fully articulated it. You prepare yourself quietly, adjust your posture slightly, steady your breath, because when the bowl reaches you, it's not just about drinking tea, it's about participating in everything that led up to this moment, the preparation, the care, the intention behind every movement. You receive the bowl, it's warm in your hands, grounding in a way that feels immediate and real. The surface is smooth but not perfect, those subtle irregularities again, reminding you that this is something crafted, not manufactured. You turn it gently, just as you've seen, then bring it closer. The scent reaches you first. Earthy, fresh, slightly grassy. It's different from anything you've experienced before, but not unfamiliar in a way that feels distant. You take a slow sip. The taste is rich, slightly bitter, but balanced. It lingers, inviting you to notice it fully rather than rushing past it. And for a moment, everything else fades. No thoughts about what comes next, no distractions, just this single experience. And as you lower the bowl, returning it with the same care you received it, you realize something quietly profound. The tea itself isn't the point. It's everything that surrounds it. The preparation, the presentation, the shared attention, the act of being fully present for something simple. And as the bowl moves on to the next guest, the rhythm continues, unchanged, steady, intentional. You sit back slightly, letting the experience settle, not as something finished, but as something still unfolding, because here, even the smallest act is part of something much larger. The warmth of the tea lingers long after the bowl leaves your hands, not just on your tongue, but somewhere quieter, your breath, your posture, the way your thoughts have slowed without asking permission. Nothing rushes back in to replace it. The ceremony continues, but not with new actions so much as a deepening of what's already there. You notice the silence again, not empty, not awkward. Each guest has now tasted the tea, and in that simple act, something subtle has connected everyone in the room. There's no conversation about it, no need to compare impressions or describe flavors like a modern tasting session. No one says, "Notes of grass," with a hint of existential calm, though honestly, not inaccurate. Instead, the experience remains internal, personal, but also collective in a quiet way. You sit with it. The host, too, has returned to stillness. The utensils rest where they were placed, the bowl now empty but still holding the memory of what it contained. The kettle hums softly, a low, steady presence that anchors the space. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness. In traditional tea gatherings, silence and minimal conversation are often intentional, allowing participants to focus fully on the sensory and emotional aspects of the experience. You understand that now, words would almost feel intrusive, not because they're unwelcome, but because they would shift the focus outward, away from the shared stillness that has formed. You glance gently around the room, careful not to disrupt the quiet. Each person sits in their own space, but no one feels distant. There's a subtle awareness of each other, a shared participation that doesn't require acknowledgement. It's a different kind of connection, one that doesn't rely on speaking. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on silence in the tea ceremony was primarily influenced by Zen Buddhist practices or developed independently as part of the ritual's aesthetic. But sitting here, the distinction feels less important than the effect. The silence works. It creates space. You become aware of the smallest details again. The faint texture of the tatami beneath you, the soft light filtering through the paper screens, the gentle sound of the kettle, steady and unchanging. Even your own breathing feels like part of the environment now. In, out. No need to control it. No need to think about it. Just present. A quirky detail drifts into your thoughts. In some tea gatherings, the sound of boiling water in the kettle is appreciated almost like music, often described as resembling wind through pine trees. You listen more closely. At first, it's just a soft, consistent sound. But as your attention settles, it becomes something more layered, more textured. Not loud, not dramatic, but quietly expressive. It's surprising how much you can notice when nothing is competing for your attention. You shift slightly, adjusting your posture again. Even that small movement feels intentional, part of the ongoing rhythm of the space. There's no sense of impatience, no checking the time. At this point, has probably given up trying to be relevant. Instead, there's a gentle acceptance of the moment as it is. No need to move it forward. No need to reach an ending, just being here is enough. You think back, briefly, to everything that led to this point. The careful preparation, the precise movement, the shared act of drinking tea. Each step built toward this quiet stillness. And now that you're here, you realize this might be the most important part, not the action, but the pause afterward, the space where everything settles. You rest your hands lightly in your lap, feeling the warmth of your body, the calm in your breathing. There's nothing you need to do, nothing you need to say, and yet you're fully engaged, fully present. That's the subtle shift this ceremony creates. It doesn't add more to your experience. It removes what isn't needed, leaving only what remains. You glance once more at the host, who sits quietly, just as still as everyone else now. There's no sense of hierarchy in this moment, just shared presence. The roles have softened: host and guest, action and stillness. They've all blended into the same quiet awareness. And as you sit there, surrounded by that calm, you begin to understand something that feels almost difficult to put into words. The ceremony isn't about doing things perfectly. It's about noticing them fully. Every movement, every sound, every breath. You let that thought settle, not analyzing it, not trying to define it further, just letting it exist, because here that's enough. And as the silence continues, not empty but rich with quiet meaning, you remain where you are, not waiting, not anticipating, just being. The silence doesn't end so much as it gently loosens its hold. You don't notice a clear moment when it changes, only that something begins to move again, softly, respectfully, as if not to disturb what has just settled. The host shifts first, a small motion, almost imperceptible, but it carries meaning. The ceremony is beginning to close, not abruptly, not with a sense of finality, but with the same care that guided its beginning. Every movement now mirrors what came before, but in reverse. Utensils returned, space restored, the quiet structure of the ritual slowly unwinding. You watch as the tea bowl is handled once more, cleaned with the same deliberate attention it received earlier. The cloth moves again, folded, unfolded. Each gesture familiar now, like a pattern you've come to understand without needing explanation. A mainstream historical fact settles into your awareness. The closing phase of a tea ceremony is just as important as the preparation, emphasizing respect for the tools, the space, and the shared experience that has taken place. Nothing is left unfinished, nothing is dismissed, even the ending is given its full weight. You feel it in the room, the shift from stillness to completion. Not an ending in the sense of something stopping, but a transition, a gentle return to the world beyond this space. Historians still argue whether the tea ceremony was originally intended as a deeply spiritual act or evolved over time into a refined cultural practice. But as you sit here, the distinction feels less important than the effect it leaves behind, because something has changed, not dramatically, not in a way that demands attention, but subtly. You notice it in your breathing, still slower than before, in your posture, still more grounded, in your thoughts, which seem less crowded, less urgent. The host completes the final movements, placing each item back in its proper position. The kettle settles, the cloth is folded one last time. The space returns to its original simplicity, but now it feels different. You've experienced it, and that experience lingers. A quirky detail drifts into your awareness. In some tea traditions, guests may take a final moment to examine the utensils or appreciate the craftsmanship of the items used, acknowledging the artistry involved in even the simplest objects. You glance once more at the bowl, the scoop, the whisk. They haven't changed, but your perception of them has. They're no longer just tools. They're part of a process, a shared moment that gave them meaning. You shift slightly, preparing to stand. The movement is slow, careful, as if your body has learned something from the pace of the ceremony and isn't quite ready to let it go. One by one, the guests begin to rise. There's no rush to the exit, no sudden return to noise or urgency. Even leaving is done with intention. You step toward the small entrance again, the low doorway that requires you to bow as you pass through. This time, the motion feels different, not just an acknowledgement of the space, but of the experience itself. A quiet thank you, not spoken, but understood. You step outside, and the air feels a little brighter, a little more open. The world hasn't changed, but your awareness of it has. You notice the path again, the stones beneath your feet, the subtle sounds of nature, the way the light falls across the ground. Everything is the same, and yet it isn't, because now you're noticing it, really noticing it. You walk slowly, not out of obligation, but because the pace feels right. There's no need to rush back into anything, no need to fill the space that the ceremony created. You carry it with you instead, that quiet attention, that gentle awareness, the understanding that even the simplest actions, walking, breathing, observing, can hold depth when you allow them to. And as you continue along the path, the memory of the room, the tea, the shared silence begins to soften, not disappearing, just settling into something quieter. Something you can return to even outside that space. You take one last slow breath, letting it out gently. The world continues around you, as it always does. But now, there's a small part of you that moves differently within it, a little slower, a little more aware. And as that awareness settles into a calm, steady rhythm, the experience of the ceremony fades, not into absence, but into something softer, something that doesn't need to be held tightly to remain, just a quiet presence, lingering. And as your steps carry you forward, unhurried and light, The night seems just a little more peaceful than before.